The wind moves across a cold plain beneath a sky that seems impossibly wide. Low grass bends around patches of frost, herds of large animals drift along the horizon, and somewhere beyond the next ridge a small group of humans is moving through the same landscape. But they are not necessarily people like us. Their bodies may be broader, their faces heavier, their limbs shaped by generations of life in colder climates. Far to the east, another human population survives in mountains and forests, known to modern science almost entirely from fragments of bone and traces of DNA. On distant islands, still stranger relatives persist, some unusually small, others carrying combinations of features that do not fit comfortably into the categories once used to describe human evolution. For much of prehistory, humanity is not a single species walking alone through an empty world. It is a crowded family. That fact is easy to forget because the modern world gives no visible hint of it. Every person alive today belongs to Homo sapiens. Wherever humans travel, whether across deserts, tropical forests, mountains, or polar landscapes, they encounter only other members of the same surviving species. Yet tens of thousands of years ago, this would not have been true. A traveller moving across parts of Eurasia might have entered territories used by Neanderthals. Farther east populations related to the mysterious Denisovans occupied regions extending across enormous distances. In Southeast Asia, isolated islands preserved human lineages with evolutionary histories very different from those of the large-bodied populations of the continents. Africa itself, the homeland of Homo sapiens, may also have contained deeply separated populations whose identities remain difficult to reconstruct. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in fossils and genomes suggests a human world far more diverse than the one that exists today. This diversity does not mean that prehistoric landscapes were crowded with cities or enormous populations. Quite the opposite. Human groups were often small, scattered and separated by immense distances. A few dozen individuals might move through a valley for part of the year and disappear again with the seasons. Another group could occupy a cave system hundreds of kilometers away, leaving behind stone flakes, butchered bones, fireplaces, and almost nothing else. Populations might expand during warmer periods and retreat when climates worsened. Entire regions could become nearly empty for generations. What makes the ancient world remarkable is not the number of humans living in it, but the number of different evolutionary lineages surviving at the same time. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The most familiar of these lost cousins are the Neanderthals. For more than a century, they were presented as crude, dim and doomed, almost as though evolution had produced them merely to demonstrate why modern humans deserve to replace them. That picture has steadily collapsed. Neanderthals survive across Western Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to environments that repeatedly swing between bitter glacial conditions and milder intervals. They control fire, manufacture complex stone tools, hunt dangerous animals at close range, and maintain social groups capable of supporting injured individuals who could not have survived alone. Some sites preserve evidence suggesting the deliberate use of pigments, feathers, shells, or other materials with no obvious nutritional value. Scholars still debate the meaning of several such finds, but the old image of a barely intelligent brute has become increasingly difficult to defend, and Neanderthals are only one part of the story. In 2010, genetic evidence from a tiny finger bone found in Denisova cave in Siberia revealed a population that had barely been suspected before. The bone looked unremarkable. Its DNA did not. It belonged to a group genetically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals. These Denisovans left frustratingly few fossils that can be confidently assigned to them, yet their genetic legacy survives in living populations, especially in parts of Oceania and Asia. Their existence is a reminder of how much of the ancient human world may remain almost invisible. A whole population can disappear from the fossil record and still leave pieces of itself inside people, living tens of thousands of years later. Farther south, on the Indonesian island of Flores, another discovery made the human family stranger still. Homo floresiensis, sometimes informally called the Hobbit because of its small stature, lived until surprisingly recent times in geological terms. Adults stood little more than a meter tall, yet they made stone tools and survived in an island ecosystem populated by giant rats, reptiles, and now extinct dwarf elephants known as stegodonts. Their small bodies may have evolved through island dwarfism, a process seen in other mammals when limited resources favor reduced size over many generations. Their ancestry remains debated. Some researchers connect them to Homo erectus populations that reached Southeast Asia and later became smaller in isolation, while others argue that aspects of their anatomy may preserve traits from a more ancient branch of the human family. Then there is Homo luzonensis from the Philippines, known from a handful of teeth and bones discovered in Callao Cave. Some of its features appear surprisingly primitive, while others look more recent, creating another anatomical puzzle. The fossils are limited and no complete skull has emerged to give the population a recognizable face. Yet their presence reinforces a pattern becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Late prehistoric Asia was not simply a stage occupied by modern humans and Neanderthals. It may have contained a mosaic of human populations, some widespread, others isolated on islands or in mountains, each shaped by different environments and evolutionary histories. Africa adds another layer of uncertainty. Homo sapiens emerges there, but the process does not look like a single population suddenly becoming modern in one small place. Fossils from different regions show varying combinations of traits, and genetic studies suggest long periods of population structure and reconnection. Other human forms may have survived alongside early Homo sapiens, though assigning fragmentary fossils to precise species remains controversial. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa, carries a particularly strange mixture of features. Its brain is relatively small, yet parts of its hands, feet, and legs look surprisingly human-like. Fossils indicate that it survived until roughly the same broad period in which early Homo sapiens already existed in Africa. What exactly the two populations knew of one another, if anything, remains beyond the evidence we currently possess. The result is a picture of deep time that feels less like a straight road and more like a branching forest. Human evolution does not move neatly from primitive ancestor to improved descendant. Different populations overlap. Some endure for hundreds of thousands of years. Some migrate. Some become isolated. Some meet again after long separations. Some exchange genes. Others vanish without leaving obvious descendants. The boundaries between species populations and lineages become especially difficult when ancient groups are close enough genetically to interbreed, but different enough to follow separate evolutionary paths. By around 50,000 years ago, this complicated family is approaching one of the most important transitions in human history. Homo sapiens is expanding farther across Eurasia. Neanderthals still occupy large portions of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovan-related populations remain somewhere across the east. Island lineages survive beyond deep water crossings that earlier humans somehow managed to make. For a brief window, perhaps one of the last such windows in Earth's history, several kinds of humans inhabit the planet at once, and then one by one nearly all of them disappear. Understanding why requires going much farther back before their final encounters, before the migrations that brought them together, and before the genetic traces that would eventually expose their relationships. The lost cousins of humanity did not appear suddenly. They were the products of ancient separations, long journeys, climatic upheavals, and populations divided across continents for spans of time longer than recorded history can easily make imaginable. To understand the world they shared, the first step is to understand how the human family became divided in the first place. Long before Neanderthals shelter beneath the limestone cliffs of Europe, before Denisovans leave their genetic traces across Asia, and before Homo sapiens carries its tools and stories beyond Africa, the human family has already been splitting apart for hundreds of thousands of years. The branches are difficult to follow, because evolution rarely leaves behind a clean sequence of ancestors waiting to be arranged like portraits on a wall. Fossils appear in scattered places, often as fragments. Populations move, disappear, mix, and reappear. Anatomical traits evolve at different speeds. A skull can look surprisingly ancient, while a jaw or tooth seems more recent, and the temptation to force every fossil into a simple progression has repeatedly created categories that later discoveries complicate. What survives in the record suggests not a ladder leading toward modern humanity, but a network of populations repeatedly separated and reunited by geography and climate. The deeper roots of this story extend into Africa more than 1 million years ago, when members of the genus Homo are already spreading beyond the continent. Homo erectus, broadly defined, becomes one of the most successful human forms ever to exist. Fossils associated with populations often placed within this group appear from Africa to the Caucasus, China, and Indonesia. The exact relationships among these fossils remain debated, and some researchers divide them into several species, but their geographic reach is extraordinary. They survive across changing environments for immense spans of time, carrying stone technologies into territories no earlier hominin had occupied so extensively. Some descendants of these dispersing populations may eventually contribute to later human groups in Asia, although the evolutionary connections are not always clear enough to draw direct lines. By several 100,000 years ago, another set of human populations appears across Africa and Eurasia, with brains generally larger than those of earlier Homo erectus, and bodies suited to active hunting. Fossils traditionally assigned to Homo heidelbergensis have often been placed near the center of this story. The name itself, however, hides substantial uncertainty. Specimens given that label come from different regions and periods, and they do not necessarily represent one coherent species. Some European fossils show features moving toward the characteristic anatomy of Neanderthals. African fossils may sit closer to populations ancestral to Homo sapiens. Researchers increasingly treat the Middle Pleistocene as a complicated period of regional evolution, rather than a convenient moment when a single ancestral species neatly divided into 3 descendants. Europe provides one of the clearest examples of gradual change. Fossils from sites such as Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain reveal humans living more than 400,000 years ago, who already possess several Neanderthal-like features. Their faces, teeth, and aspects of their skulls suggest that the Neanderthal lineage is taking shape long before the classic Neanderthals of the later Ice Age appear. Ancient genetic material recovered from these fossils has made the picture even more intriguing. Their nuclear DNA places them close to Neanderthals, while early mitochondrial results revealed unexpected connections that initially seemed Denisovan-like. The details have required careful interpretation, but the larger lesson is clear: the divergence of these populations was not a single clean event. Gene flow and population replacement may already have been shaping the family tree. Genetic estimates generally place the separation between the lineage leading toward Homo sapiens and the lineage ancestral to Neanderthals and Denisovans hundreds of thousands of years in the past. Later, the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans themselves become increasingly distinct. Geography likely plays a major role. Western Eurasian populations move through Europe and adjacent regions, eventually becoming Neanderthals. Populations farther east contribute to what scientists now call Denisovans, although the geographic extent and diversity hidden behind that name are still being discovered. Mountains, deserts, ice sheets, and vast distances repeatedly isolate small groups. During favorable climates, corridors open and populations expand. During harsher phases, habitats contract into refuges. Over enough generations, separation creates genetic and anatomical differences, yet later contact can partially erase those divisions. Africa follows an equally complex path. Early Homo sapiens does not emerge fully formed in a single moment. Fossils from places such as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, and Herto in Ethiopia show combinations of features documenting a long process toward modern anatomy. Jebel Irhoud, dating to roughly 300,000 years ago, preserves faces that look unexpectedly modern alongside more elongated brain cases. Other fossils elsewhere in Africa carry different mixtures of ancient and derived characteristics. This has helped support models in which Homo sapiens develops within interconnected populations spread across much of the continent rather than inside one isolated birthplace. Climate continually rearranges those connections. The Sahara, for example, repeatedly shifts between extremely dry conditions and greener periods when lakes, grasslands, and river networks allow animals and humans to cross regions that later become formidable barriers. This changing African landscape matters because human populations can remain separated for thousands of generations without being permanently cut off. One population develops particular traits in the south, another in the east or north, and later expansions bring them back into contact. Genes spread, technologies travel, populations merge, then environmental change separates them again. Scholars still debate the exact structure of these ancient African populations, but modern genetic diversity strongly reflects a long and complicated history rather than a single, simple origin event. Meanwhile, the ancestors of Neanderthals are becoming increasingly specialized for Eurasian conditions. Their bodies eventually develop broad trunks, powerful limbs, and other proportions well suited to conserving heat, though not every feature can be explained solely as an adaptation to cold. Their faces become distinctive with projecting midfaces and large nasal regions. Their bones suggest physically demanding lives. Denisovans remain much harder to visualize. Only a small number of fossils can be confidently linked to them, including teeth fragments of bone and a remarkable jaw from the Tibetan Plateau, whose identification was supported through ancient protein evidence. Yet genetic data imply that Denisovan populations themselves may have been deeply diverse. The word Denisovan could therefore conceal several populations separated from one another for long periods, rather than a single uniform people stretching across Asia. One particularly surprising clue comes from the genomes of later individuals. Neanderthals and Denisovans did not merely split and remain isolated. Their ancestors exchanged genes with other populations, including groups so ancient that scientists sometimes describe them as super-archaic lineages. The identity of these populations is uncertain. Some models propose that descendants of much earlier Eurasian dispersals survived long enough to interbreed with the ancestors of Denisovans. Because no confirmed genome from such a population has yet been recovered, the conclusion depends on statistical patterns within later DNA, rather than a named fossil species. No single explanation fully accounts for every signal, but these traces hint at meetings between human groups whose evolutionary histories had already been separate for enormous spans of time. This makes the concept of a human species increasingly slippery. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens clearly develop distinct evolutionary identities, yet those boundaries are not absolute. Populations can diverge for hundreds of thousands of years and still retain enough biological compatibility to produce descendants when they meet again. Evolution creates branches, but some branches reconnect. By the time recognizable Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, and Denisovan-related groups inhabit different parts of the Old World. Their differences have been accumulating through an age of glaciers, droughts, migrations, bottlenecks, and renewed contact. None knows that it belongs to a branch of anything. Each group simply inhabits its own world of rivers, animals, seasons, stone, fire, and remembered landscapes. To them, survival is immediate. The grand evolutionary pattern exists only when viewed from hundreds of thousands of years later, and among all these branches, one of the most enduring has already made Western Eurasia its home. For generation after generation, through climates capable of transforming entire continents, the Neanderthals survived there not as a failed rehearsal for modern humans, but as a successful humanity in their own right. Across the limestone valleys of Europe and the cold uplands of Western Asia, Neanderthals live in a world that can turn hostile with extraordinary speed. Forests advance during warmer intervals, then retreat as temperatures fall. Open steppe spreads beneath dry winds. Herds migrate across broad plains, and the animals available in one generation may be replaced by very different communities in the next. Glaciers grow and shrink over immense cycles, reshaping rivers, coastlines, and entire ecosystems. To survive here for hundreds of thousands of years requires more than strength. It requires flexibility, memory cooperation, and a detailed understanding of landscapes that are never entirely stable. The familiar image of the Neanderthal as a shambling brute begins to fall apart almost immediately when their daily lives are examined closely. Their bodies are indeed powerful. Adults are generally shorter and more heavily built than many recent human populations, with thick bones and large joint surfaces. Their rib cages are broad, their limbs muscular, and the lower arms and legs are relatively short proportions that may help conserve heat in cold conditions. But this physique is not evidence of clumsiness. Neanderthal skeletons show that they walk fully upright, move efficiently, and depend on physically demanding activities. Their hands are capable of both strong gripping and precise manipulation. Their brains are on average as large as or larger than those of modern humans, although brain size alone says little about cognition. Their technology reveals far more. Neanderthals are associated most famously with Middle Paleolithic tool traditions, including what archaeologists call the Mysterian. A typical toolkit includes carefully prepared stone flakes, scrapers' points, and cutting implements produced through methods that require planning several steps in advance. One sophisticated approach, known as the levallois technique, begins by shaping a stone core so that a final strike removes a flake of predetermined form. It is not accidental smashing. The toolmaker must understand the structure of the stone, anticipate how force will travel through it, and maintain the intended geometry through repeated preparation. The finished flakes can then be modified for different tasks, from working hides to butchering animals or shaping wood. Some Neanderthal tools become even more complex. Evidence from several sites suggests that stone points were attached to wooden shafts using bindings or natural adhesives. At Königsauer in Germany, lumps of birch tar dating to the Neanderthal period indicate the controlled production or use of a substance that does not simply appear ready-made in nature. Producing birch tar requires heating bark under conditions where oxygen is limited, although scholars still debate exactly which techniques prehistoric people used. Whatever the method, the adhesive represents a kind of material transformation. bark becomes a sticky compound that can help secure stone to wood. It is a small detail, but it reveals a technical world more sophisticated than the stereotype allows. Fire is equally important. Neanderthals use hearths for warmth, cooking protection, and perhaps tool production. Not every site preserves clear evidence of repeated fire use, and researchers continue to debate how consistently Neanderthals could ignite fire rather than merely maintain naturally obtained flames. Yet many occupations leave concentrated ash, burned bone charcoal, and heated sediment. Around these hearths, food is processed and bodies gather. A cave illuminated by fire is not simply warmer. It creates a social centre, a place where tasks can continue after sunset, and where information can pass between generations. Hunting provides some of the most dramatic evidence of coordination. Neanderthals regularly kill larger animals, including red deer, reindeer, bison, horses, and in some regions even rhinoceroses or mammoths. Cut marks on bones and patterns of carcass processing show deliberate butchery. At some sites, the age profiles of prey suggest selective hunting rather than random scavenging. Wooden spears from the broader Middle Pleistocene demonstrate that close-range hunting weapons existed long before the final Neanderthal period. Later evidence suggests that Neanderthals also used thrusting, or possibly thrown spears tipped with stone. Approaching a large animal with such weapons is dangerous. Successful hunting likely depends on knowledge of animal behavior, terrain timing, and cooperation among several individuals. The danger is written into Neanderthal bones. Many skeletons carry healed fractures, damaged joints, or signs of repeated physical stress. Some researchers once compared the injury patterns to those of modern rodeo riders, though such comparisons are imperfect. What matters more is that certain individuals survive serious injuries long enough for the bones to heal. At Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq, one Neanderthal man survives extensive trauma, including damage to an arm and injuries affecting his vision. He lives for years after these impairments develop. Whether every aspect of his survival required direct long-term assistance cannot be proven, but the evidence strongly suggests that Neanderthal groups did not simply abandon every member who became less productive. Other sites reinforce this picture. Individuals survive tooth loss severe enough to make ordinary chewing difficult. Some recover from fractures. The elderly, by prehistoric standards, continue living despite physical deterioration. Care may have taken many forms, sharing food, processing meat into easier textures, helping injured individuals move, or simply allowing them to remain within the group while others supplied resources. None of this requires romanticizing Neanderthal society. Their world is still harsh, infant mortality is high, and violence or accidents are real. But social support appears to be part of their survival strategy. Then there are behaviors once regarded as uniquely symbolic. Neanderthal sites preserve pieces of mineral pigment, especially red or black substances such as ochre and manganese dioxide. Eagle talons from some European sites show cut marks that may indicate deliberate removal and possibly use as ornaments. Perforated shells and coloured objects have also been associated with Neanderthal contexts. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, pigments and modified shells have been dated to a period that may precede the arrival of Homo sapiens in Western Europe. If the dating and interpretation are correct, Neanderthals are engaging in symbolic or decorative behaviour independently. Scholars still debate individual cases because archaeological contexts can be complicated, but the cumulative evidence makes it increasingly difficult to claim that Neanderthals lacked all symbolic thought. Even their treatment of the dead remains intriguing. Several Neanderthal skeletons appear in positions that some archaeologists interpret as deliberate burial. The famous remains from Shanidar Cave sparked decades of debate, after pollen near one skeleton was initially taken as evidence of flowers placed with the dead. Later research offered alternative explanations, including burrowing animals that could have transported pollen. More recent excavations at Shanidar have nevertheless strengthened the case that at least some bodies were intentionally placed within the cave. Deliberate burial does not automatically prove religion, ritual, or ideas about an afterlife. It does show that corpses may sometimes have been treated differently from ordinary refuse. Their diets are equally varied. Chemical analysis of bones often indicates heavy reliance on animal protein in cold European environments, placing some Neanderthal groups surprisingly high in the food chain. Yet plant remains trapped in dental calculus reveal the consumption of seeds, tubers, grasses, and other vegetation. At coastal sites, Neanderthals exploit shellfish and marine resources. In warmer regions, their diets can be broad and opportunistic. The popular image of a hunter surviving almost entirely on mammoth meat therefore fails to capture the ecological range seen across different populations. Neanderthals are not one unchanging people spread across an entire continent. Groups separated by mountains and hundreds of generations develop their own traditions. Tool styles vary. Hunting strategies shift with prey. Populations contract during extreme cold and expand when habitats improve. Genetic evidence suggests repeated bottlenecks, leaving many Neanderthal groups small and relatively isolated. This may eventually become a dangerous weakness, but for most of their existence it does not prevent them from surviving conditions that would challenge any human population. For tens of thousands of generations they know European valleys in extraordinary detail. They know where flint can be quarried, where herds pass through narrow terrain, where caves remain dry through winter, and which plants appear when the snow withdraws. Children grow up learning these patterns from adults who inherited them from earlier generations. Their knowledge is not written, but it is carried in movement, habit, technique, and memory. Then something changes. Another human population begins appearing more consistently at the edges of Neanderthal territory. These newcomers are not entirely strangers in evolutionary terms. Their lineages separated long ago, yet they remain close enough to recognize one another biologically in a way that will eventually leave evidence inside living genomes. Before those encounters become clear, however, another lost population has to emerge from almost complete darkness, a people modern science will discover not from a skull or a skeleton, but from a tiny fragment hidden inside a Siberian cave, deep in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. Denisova Cave opens into a landscape that has repeatedly changed character across the Ice Age. At times, the surrounding valleys are cold and open, crossed by herds adapted to steppe conditions. At other times, forests return, and the cave becomes part of a richer, milder environment. Humans use this place again and again over astonishing stretches of time. Neanderthals occupy it. Later, Homo sapiens leave traces nearby. But buried among layers of sediment is evidence for another population, one that modern researchers do not initially know exists. Its discovery begins with almost nothing, a tiny piece of a finger bone from a young individual small enough to fit comfortably in a hand. Anatomically, it offers little that seems revolutionary. Genetically, it changes the map of human evolution. When researchers recover ancient DNA from the fragment, they expect it to belong either to a Neanderthal or perhaps to an early Homo sapiens. Instead, the genetic sequence falls outside both. The individual belongs to a lineage that shares an ancestor with Neanderthals, but has been separated from them for hundreds of thousands of years. The population becomes known as the Denisovans, named not after themselves, since no original name survives, but after the cave where the first recognized genetic evidence is found. It is an unusually modern way to discover an ancient people. Earlier extinct human groups were generally defined from skulls, teeth, and skeletons first, with genetics added later. Denisovans arrive in scientific history almost in reverse. Their genome becomes visible before their bodies do. That imbalance creates one of the strangest mysteries in paleoanthropology. Scientists can reconstruct substantial portions of Denisovan genetic history, yet they still cannot confidently describe what an average Denisovan face looks like. A few large teeth from Denisova cave are associated with the lineage along with fragments of bone, but there is no complete Denisovan skull from which a familiar reconstruction can be made with certainty. This means a population once spread across immense parts of Asia is in a physical sense almost faceless. Their presence is detected not by rows of skeletons, but by molecules preserved in bone sediment and the genomes of people alive today. The cave itself reveals that Denisovans are not fleeting visitors. Genetic evidence indicates that different Denisovan individuals occupy the region during different periods, separated in some cases by tens of thousands of years. Their population history is complex, and the individuals sampled from the cave do not necessarily represent the full diversity of Denisovans elsewhere. This distinction matters because the genetic legacy found in modern humans suggests that Denisovan-related populations once existed across a far greater geographic range than Siberia alone. One of the clearest clues appears thousands of kilometers away in people living today in Melanesia and parts of island Southeast Asia. Some populations carry several percent Denisovan ancestry, far more than most mainland Eurasian groups. Smaller but detectable Denisovan-related genetic contributions appear across portions of East, South, and Southeast Asia. The pattern cannot easily be explained by a single encounter near Denisova cave. It suggests that Homo sapiens met Denisovan-related populations somewhere much farther south or east, perhaps on the Asian mainland in Southeast Asia, or in regions connected to ancient migration routes toward New Guinea. Scholars still debate exactly where these encounters occurred because the relevant fossils remain frustratingly scarce. The Denisovan label may therefore conceal a broad family of populations rather than one homogeneous group. Genetic analyses suggest deep divisions among different Denisovan-related lineages, possibly indicating that populations remain separated across Asia for very long periods. A Denisovan living in Siberia may have been genetically distinct from Denisovan-related humans, encountered by the ancestors of Papuans. If so, using a single name for all of them is convenient but potentially misleading, rather like applying one label to numerous regional populations that had already developed their own histories. A remarkable fossil from the Tibetan Plateau expands the story further. In Baixia Karst Cave high above sea level, researchers identify a robust human jaw from Ziahe. Ancient DNA is not initially available from the specimen, but proteins preserved in the teeth support a close relationship to Denisovans. The jaw indicates that Denisovan-related humans are living on the Tibetan Plateau long before modern Tibetan populations established themselves there. This is a harsh environment with low oxygen levels that impose severe physiological challenges. The discovery weakens any assumption that archaic humans survive only in comfortable lowland habitats. Denisovan-related populations appear capable of occupying some of the most demanding environments on Earth. The connection becomes more striking because many modern Tibetans possess a version of the IPAS1 gene associated with adaptation to high altitude. Genetic studies indicate that this variant entered the ancestors of modern humans through ancient interbreeding with a Denisovan-related population. The exact history remains under investigation, but the broader conclusion is powerful. A genetic contribution from an extinct human group likely helps living people thrive in environments where oxygen is scarce. Denisovan ancestry is therefore not merely a fossil trace. In certain contexts, it becomes biologically consequential. Material culture associated with Denisovans is harder to assign. Denisova cave contains sophisticated objects including ornaments and a polished stone bracelet, but identifying who made every artifact is difficult because different human groups used the cave at different times and sediment layers can be disturbed. Some objects may have been produced by Denisovans, while others could belong to Homo sapiens or another population. Archaeologists therefore resist turning attractive artifacts into proof of behavior unless the association is secure. The evidence remains incomplete, but there is no genetic reason to assume Denisovans were cognitively primitive simply because their skeletons are rare. Then one fossil from Denisova cave provides something even more extraordinary than the first finger bone. A small fragment from a long bone is genetically analysed and found to belong to a young female whose mother was Neanderthal and whose father was Denisovan. Her genome preserves the relationship with astonishing clarity. She's a first-generation child of two populations that had already been evolutionarily distinct for hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers nickname her Denisova 11, sometimes informally Denny. Her existence transforms an abstract claim about interbreeding into the life of one individual who once moved through this mountainous landscape. Her father himself carries traces of Neanderthal ancestry from an earlier interbreeding event, meaning contact between the populations did not happen only once. The Altai may have functioned as a shifting borderland where different human groups repeatedly expanded, retreated, and met as climates changed. Neanderthals seem to enter the region from the west. Denisovan populations occupy parts of Asia. When environmental conditions bring them into overlapping territory, biological boundaries do not prevent reproduction. Yet the story does not become simple, merely because contact is proven. Interbreeding could have been rare even if genetically important. Population sizes may have been tiny. Encounters might have occurred only when climatic change pushed groups into the same valleys. Cultural differences could have been significant even when biological compatibility remained. Nothing in the DNA tells us whether such meetings were peaceful, violent, temporary, cooperative, or all of these at different times. More surprising still, Denisovan genomes contain hints of ancestry from a much older unknown population. Statistical models suggest that some DNA may derive from a lineage that diverged from other humans far earlier, potentially descendants of an ancient dispersal into Eurasia. No confirmed fossil genome identifies this population. It is another ghost detected indirectly, a shadow behind an already shadowy people. Asia therefore begins to look less like the empty eastern edge of the human story and more like an evolutionary continent filled with overlapping populations whose fossils have barely been found. Denisovans occupy mountains, probably lowlands, and perhaps regions extending deep into Southeast Asia. Their genes travel into Homo sapiens. Their relatives may survive in places where preservation is poor and archaeological exploration remains limited, and as scientists discover how incomplete the Asian record really is, an island far to the south offers an even more disruptive clue. There beneath volcanic sediment, archaeologists uncover the skeleton of a human whose adult body is scarcely taller than a young modern child. It belongs neither to Homo sapiens nor to any known Denisovan fossil. On Flores, isolation has produced one of the most unexpected members of the human family. Far south of the Siberian mountains, beyond the great landmass of continental Asia, the human story crosses a boundary that should have made movement difficult long before anyone possessed boats capable of leaving archaeological traces. The Indonesian island of Flores lies within Wallacea, a region of islands separated from both mainland Asia and Australia by deep water channels. Even during Ice Age periods when sea levels fall dramatically, and enormous areas of continental shelf become dry land. Flores does not simply connect to the Asian mainland. Reaching it requires crossing open water. Yet stone tools suggest that humans or human ancestors are present on Flores hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens spreads through the region. Whoever reaches this island becomes isolated in an evolutionary laboratory unlike anything on the continents. Flores is a place where familiar biological rules produce unfamiliar creatures. Limited resources and isolation can transform the body sizes of mammals over long periods. Large species sometimes become smaller, while small species can become unusually large. Ancient Flores contains dwarf stegodonts, relatives of elephants reduced dramatically in size, alongside giant rats and large reptiles including Komodo dragons. Into this strange ecosystem comes a human population whose origins remain one of the most debated puzzles in recent paleoanthropology. The discovery that forces scientists to reconsider the human history of the island comes from Liang Bua, a limestone cave in western Flores. Excavations reveal stone artifacts, animal remains, and eventually a partial human skeleton, unlike any expected from such a recent geological period. The individual designated LB1 is an adult female, yet she stands only a little over 1 meter tall. Her brain is extraordinarily small compared with that of Homo sapiens, and her skull retains features that appear archaic. Additional remains from other individuals show that LB1 is not simply an unusually small modern human. Researchers recognize a distinct species, Homo floresiensis. The announcement causes immediate controversy. Some critics initially argue that the skeleton could represent a modern human affected by a developmental disorder. Various medical explanations are proposed, including microcephaly and other conditions capable of producing unusual skull or body proportions. But as researchers examine the entire anatomy and additional individuals are identified, the pathological explanation becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The wrist bones, shoulder, pelvis, feet, teeth, and other features form a combination that cannot easily be explained as a single diseased Homo sapiens individual. Homo floresiensis is now widely accepted as a distinct extinct human relative, although its precise ancestry remains unsettled. That ancestry presents two broad possibilities, each remarkable in a different way. One hypothesis proposes that Homo floresiensis descends from Homo erectus, or an erectus-related population that reached the region and became dramatically smaller after long isolation. Island dwarfism is well documented among other mammals, and Flores itself provides an obvious example in its dwarf stegodonts. If an ancestral human population faced limited food and relatively low pressure from large mammalian predators, smaller bodies may have become advantageous because they require fewer calories, but certain anatomical features of Homo floresiensis appear surprisingly primitive, leading some researchers to consider an even deeper origin. Comparisons of the skeleton have suggested similarities with earlier Homo or even Australopith-like anatomy in particular parts of the body. If those interpretations are correct, the ancestors of Homo floresiensis might have left Africa before the classic expansion of Homo erectus, or belonged to an early branch of Homo whose wider Asian presence has barely been detected. The fossil evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every anatomical feature. Either possibility, however, implies a much more complicated prehistoric movement of humans through Asia than older models imagined. Even before Homo floresiensis itself appears in the fossil record, Flores contains evidence of much earlier hominin activity. Stone artifacts from the island date back more than 1 million years at some sites, indicating that an archaic human population reaches Flores extraordinarily early. Fossils from Matamenge, dating to roughly 700,000 years ago, include small hominin teeth and jaw fragments. These individuals were already remarkably small, suggesting that the evolutionary reduction in body size had occurred long before the inhabitants of Liangbua lived. Some aspects of the Matamenge material resemble Homo erectus, strengthening the possibility that an erectus-related ancestor reached Flores and then underwent island dwarfism, but getting there remains part of the mystery. The deep channels surrounding Wallacea mean that even during periods of low sea level some form of water crossing is necessary. It does not follow that the first settlers possessed sophisticated seagoing technology. Individuals might occasionally have been carried on natural rafts of vegetation after storms or floods. Yet establishing a viable population normally requires more than one accidental castaway, unless several individuals travel together or repeated crossings occur. Scholars still debate whether these early movements imply deliberate watercraft accidental dispersal, or some combination. No boat from such an ancient period survives to settle the matter. Once established, the small humans of Flores prove remarkably persistent. Their brains are only around the size expected in much earlier hominins, yet they manufacture stone tools. This creates an important warning against treating brain volume as a simple scale of intelligence. Tool-making at Liangbua includes flakes and implements useful for cutting and processing materials, while earlier tool traditions elsewhere on Flores demonstrate technological continuity over enormous spans of time. The tools are not equivalent to the elaborate technologies of much later Homo sapiens, but neither are they random broken stones. The ecology surrounding them must have demanded detailed practical knowledge. Stegodons provide meat but can be dangerous even at reduced size. Komodo dragons are formidable predators and scavengers. Seasonal conditions affect water and food availability. Volcanic activity repeatedly reshapes the island. Homo floresiensis survives not for a few desperate generations, but as part of an established ecosystem. Small stature rather than making these humans evolutionary failures may be precisely what allows them to persist on an island with limited resources. Their feet add another unexpected detail. Homo floresiensis walks upright, but its feet are proportionally long compared with those of modern humans. Several features of the lower limb differ from the anatomy associated with efficient long-distance running in Homo sapiens. The shoulder and wrist also preserve unusual characteristics. Seen as a whole, the body is not simply a miniature modern person. It represents a different solution to being human assembled through inheritance and evolution under isolation. The date of their disappearance has changed as excavations have improved. Early interpretations suggested Homo floresiensis might have survived until around 12,000 years ago, an astonishingly recent date that encouraged speculation about connections with local folklore. Later work showed that the sedimentary sequence at Liangbua was more complicated than initially understood. Current evidence places the latest known skeletal remains considerably earlier, around 50,000 years ago, while stone artifacts associated with the population may extend somewhat later, depending on context. Claims that local legends preserve direct memories of Homo floresiensis remain intriguing to popular audiences but unsupported by evidence capable of bridging such an enormous chronological gap. The revised chronology creates a different mystery because it places their disappearance near the broad period when Homo sapiens is spreading through this part of the world. Modern humans reach Sehul, the combined Ice Age landmass of Australia and New Guinea, by at least around 50,000 years ago, and probably earlier according to some evidence. To get there, they too must cross Wallacea. Their routes bring them into the wider world inhabited by Homo floresiensis. There is currently no direct evidence showing the two populations meeting on Flores. No skeleton records an encounter, and no genetic sequence from Homo floresiensis has survived to reveal interbreeding. Tropical conditions are notoriously destructive to ancient DNA, making their absence unsurprising. Climate change, volcanic events, ecological disruption, competition, or some combination could contribute to the disappearance of the island population. It is tempting to blame Homo sapiens simply because the chronology overlaps, but coincidence is not proof. What Flores establishes beyond reasonable doubt is something more fundamental. Very different kinds of humans survive until surprisingly late in prehistory. Evolution has not been steadily converging on one standard body or one inevitable outcome. While Neanderthals hunt across Europe and Denisovan-related populations occupy parts of Asia, a small-bodied human lineage is living on a tropical island behind a permanent water barrier, and Flores is not alone. Farther north, another island preserves a handful of bones and teeth whose strange mixture of features points toward yet another lost population. Once again, there is no complete face and no surviving genome. But in a Philippine cave, the crowded human world becomes more crowded still. North of Flores, scattered across another vast tropical archipelago, the Philippines presents the same geographical obstacle in an even more complicated form. Islands rise from deep water, coastlines shift as sea levels fall and rise, and channels that appear narrow on a modern map can represent formidable barriers to populations without known seafaring technology. Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines, has never been joined to mainland Asia by a dry land bridge during the period relevant to human evolution. Yet evidence increasingly shows that archaic humans reached it astonishingly early. Their presence transforms what once looked like the remote edge of prehistoric settlement into another place, where isolated human populations could follow evolutionary paths of their own. One of the first major clues comes not from a human skeleton, but from the remains of a rhinoceros discovered at Kalinga in northern Luzon. The animal's bones preserve clear evidence of butchery, including cut marks and percussion damage associated with removing meat and breaking bones. Nearby lie stone tools. The site dates to more than 700,000 years ago. Whoever butchered that rhinoceros lived on Luzon long before Homo sapiens existed in its recognizable form, and somehow descended from people who had crossed water to reach the island. No human fossil from Kalinga identifies those toolmakers. They might have belonged to an Erectus-related population, but the evidence cannot yet establish that. Their presence is nevertheless difficult to dismiss. By this point in prehistory, water crossings by archaic humans are no longer represented by Flores alone. Island Southeast Asia begins to look like a region repeatedly entered by populations whose maritime abilities, intentional or otherwise, remain poorly understood. Hundreds of thousands of years later, another clue appears inside Kalau Cave in northern Luzon. The cave lies within a limestone landscape where chambers and passages preserve sediments accumulated through deep time. In 2007, archaeologists recover a small human foot bone. At first, the fossil does not reveal the full significance of what is buried there. Continued excavations eventually produce additional teeth and fragments from hands and feet representing at least several individuals. The remains are dated to roughly 67,000 years ago and somewhat later periods. In 2019, researchers formally name a new species Homo luzonensis. It is a cautious reconstruction built from very little. There is no skull. There is no complete skeleton. There is no preserved face looking back from the late Pleistocene. The known fossils consist mainly of teeth and small bones, yet those fragments display a peculiar combination of characteristics. Some resemble features seen in more recent members of Homo. Others appear unexpectedly primitive, including aspects of finger and toe bones that recall much older hominins. The teeth add another puzzle because some are remarkably small, while their shapes and proportions do not fit comfortably within the expected range of known regional humans. This mixture is precisely why Homo luzonensis is difficult to place. Primitive-looking anatomy does not automatically mean that a population directly descends from an extremely primitive ancestor. Evolution can preserve older traits, alter them independently, or produce similar forms through different pathways. Island environments can also generate unusual combinations because small isolated populations experience distinctive selective pressures and genetic drift. With so few fossils, researchers must resist building an elaborate ancestry from a handful of anatomical similarities. One possibility is that Homo luzonensis descends from an early Homo population related to Homo erectus that entered the Philippines and subsequently evolved in isolation. Homo erectus is already present elsewhere in Southeast Asia for immense periods, making such a connection geographically plausible. Another possibility is that the lineage traces back to an even earlier dispersal of Homo, paralleling some interpretations proposed for Homo floresiensis. The evidence remains incomplete, and without more diagnostic fossils or ancient genetic material, the exact relationship between the two island populations is unknown. Their apparent similarities are nevertheless fascinating. Flores and Luzon both contain small-bodied or anatomically unusual humans separated from continental populations by deep-water crossings. Both islands preserve evidence that archaic humans arrived hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens. Both later contain distinctive human forms whose evolutionary histories cannot yet be reconstructed with confidence. It is tempting to imagine a single ancient population spreading through the islands and diversifying in isolation, but current evidence cannot demonstrate such a neat connection. They may represent separate dispersals and separate experiments in island evolution. The hands and feet of Homo luzonensis offer especially intriguing clues. Certain curved finger and toe bones resemble traits associated with much older hominins that spent more time climbing than later Homo. Yet Homo luzonensis lives tens of thousands of years ago, not millions. This does not mean these humans are simply tree-dwelling relics surviving unchanged from an ancient age. The functional meaning of the bones remains uncertain, and the rest of the skeleton is largely missing. What they demonstrate is that late human anatomy can contain combinations no simple evolutionary ladder predicts. The environment of Luzon may help explain why. An isolated population with limited gene flow can evolve rapidly in unusual directions, particularly when resources, predators, terrain, and population size differ from those of continental ancestors. Luzon contains forests, mountains, river valleys, and distinctive animal communities. During lower sea levels, surrounding islands change shape, and distances between them shrink, but Luzon remains separated by water. A human population living there for thousands of generations could become increasingly different from relatives elsewhere without ever being completely technologically stagnant. The earlier rhinoceros butchery also forces a reconsideration of archaic human behavior. Crossing to Luzon requires movement over water at some point. Accidental rafting remains possible. Tropical storms can tear away enormous mats of vegetation, and animals have colonized islands through such events. But repeated evidence of early hominins on different islands makes pure accident less satisfying as a universal explanation. Some researchers consider the possibility that archaic humans used simple rafts or other watercraft made from perishable materials. Wood, bamboo, fiber, and bark are unlikely to survive for hundreds of thousands of years in tropical environments, leaving almost no direct archaeological trace. This is one of the recurring frustrations of deep prehistory. Archaeology disproportionately preserves stone, bone, and occasionally shell, while much of human technology is likely made from materials that rot. A population can appear technologically simple because its baskets, ropes, wooden containers, shelters, digging sticks, and rafts have vanished. Stone artifacts show only the durable fraction of a much larger behavioral system. By the time Homo luzonensis occupies Kalau Cave, Homo sapiens is already beginning to move through Southeast Asia. The chronology places the two populations close enough in time for potential overlap, although direct evidence of contact has not been found. As on Flores, tropical heat makes preservation of ancient DNA extremely difficult. Without genomes, researchers cannot determine whether Homo luzonensis contributed ancestry to later people or remained genetically isolated until disappearing. The cause of that disappearance is equally uncertain. Modern humans eventually occupy the Philippines, bringing new technologies and becoming part of increasingly connected island networks. Environmental change also transforms habitats. Small populations are inherently vulnerable to disease, demographic accidents, volcanic events, and resource disruption. A lineage does not need to lose a dramatic war to vanish. A few generations of low birth rates, repeated storms, habitat loss, or failure to find partners across scattered groups can be enough when the total population is already small. This vulnerability will become important when considering the disappearance of other human relatives. Extinction is often imagined as a sudden final scene, but small populations can fade almost invisibly. One valley becomes empty. One seasonal camp is no longer visited. A neighboring group loses contact with relatives across the mountains. Eventually, a lineage that survived for thousands of generations leaves behind only teeth beneath cave sediment. Yet even the island humans do not exhaust the diversity of this ancient world. Back in Africa, where the earliest history of Homo sapiens is unfolding, another population survives with a body assembled from an astonishing mixture of traits. Its remains are found not on a remote island, but deep inside a cave system in chambers so difficult to reach that their presence creates a mystery extending beyond anatomy alone. Homo naledi is waiting in the darkness. In the limestone hills northwest of Johannesburg, beneath a landscape that has yielded some of the most important fossils in human evolutionary history, a narrow cave system opens into darkness. The Rising Star caves are not remarkable because they are easy to enter. Quite the opposite. Some passages are so constricted that modern researchers must turn sideways crawl and squeeze through spaces barely wider than a human chest. Beyond these bottlenecks lie chambers where the remains of an extraordinary population have accumulated. When the first fossils are recovered, they do not resemble any simple expectation of what a human living relatively recently in Africa should look like. The creature eventually named Homo naledi carries a brain little larger than that of much earlier hominins, yet its hands, feet, legs, and other anatomical features form a strange combination of ancient and modern characteristics. The discovery begins in 2013 when recreational cavers exploring the Rising Star system notice fossil bones inside what becomes known as the Dinaledi chamber. Paleontologists quickly realize that the remains are hominin. An excavation follows, but the physical constraints are so severe that only a small team of researchers capable of navigating the narrow passages can reach the chamber safely. Over the course of the work, they recover more than 1,000 fossil elements representing numerous individuals. Later discoveries elsewhere in the cave system add further remains. Suddenly, Homo naledi is not known from one isolated tooth or a fragment of jaw. It is represented by one of the richest collections of fossils ever assigned to a single extinct human species. Its anatomy is immediately difficult to categorize. The skull is small, with an estimated brain volume broadly comparable to that of much earlier members of the human family. The shoulders and portions of the pelvis also preserve primitive-looking characteristics. Yet the feet are remarkably human-like, and appear well suited to habitual upright walking. The legs show features consistent with effective bipedal locomotion. The hands are capable of strong precision grips, but the fingers are unusually curved, suggesting that climbing may still play an important role. Homo naledi seems adapted both to moving efficiently on the ground and to using vertical environments in ways that later Homo sapiens generally does not. At first, many researchers assume such anatomy must belong to a very ancient population, perhaps more than 1 million years old. When the fossils are eventually dated, the result is startling. The known remains fall roughly between about 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. That places Homo naledi astonishingly late in the African record, overlapping broadly with the period when early Homo sapiens already exists elsewhere on the continent. The old evolutionary ladder becomes even harder to maintain. A small brain does not automatically indicate an early date. Primitive skeletal traits can persist alongside more derived ones. Different human populations can coexist while following very different anatomical trajectories. Africa at this time may therefore contain not one human form gradually becoming modern, but several lineages occupying different ecological and geographic niches. The teeth of Homo naledi add another layer. They are relatively small compared with those of many archaic hominins and show combinations of characteristics that help distinguish the species. Wear patterns suggest a diet involving mechanically challenging foods or materials, perhaps including particles from underground plant organs or foods contaminated with grit. Researchers have attempted to reconstruct aspects of its ecology from microscopic tooth wear and other evidence, but many details remain uncertain. What survives in the record suggests a population capable of exploiting environments around the cave system for a substantial period. Then comes the question that has made Homo naledi one of the most controversial hominins discovered in recent decades. Why are so many bodies inside such inaccessible chambers? The Dinaledi chamber does not look like an ordinary living area. Large numbers of animal bones are not mixed with the hominin remains in the way expected from a predator den. There is little evidence that water transported the bodies into the chamber from elsewhere. Carnivore damage is limited. The fossils represent individuals of different ages, suggesting repeated accumulation, rather than one obvious catastrophic event. These observations have led some researchers to propose that Homo naledi deliberately placed dead members of its population inside the cave. If true, the implication is remarkable. Mortuary behavior has often been linked, sometimes too confidently, with large brains and complex symbolic cognition. Homo naledi would challenge that assumption dramatically, but the interpretation remains disputed. Other scientists argue that natural processes, accidental falls, geological changes in cave entrances, or combinations of factors could explain at least some of the accumulation. Reconstructing the cave as it existed hundreds of thousands of years ago is difficult because passages can narrow, collapse, or change over time. More recent claims have pushed the controversy further. Researchers working in Rising Star have reported possible intentional burial features and markings on cave walls that they argue may have been produced by Homo naledi. These interpretations have generated substantial debate, with critics maintaining that the dating association and evidence for deliberate engraving or burial are not yet strong enough to justify such far-reaching conclusions. The evidence remains incomplete, and extraordinary behavioral claims require especially secure contexts. For now, the possibility of deliberate body disposal is important, but it should not be treated as settled fact. Even without those disputed behaviors, Homo naledi already changes the story. Its mere survival into the middle portion of the Pleistocene proves that large brains and increasingly modern anatomy do not simply replace all earlier forms as soon as they appear. Human evolution contains long periods of overlap, A population can preserve ancient traits while living alongside distant relatives whose anatomy is much closer to that of people today. Its small brain is particularly instructive because brain size has often been used as shorthand for intelligence. Homo naledi makes that shortcut uncomfortable. Its hand anatomy indicates sophisticated manipulation was possible. Its feet and lower limbs show effective terrestrial movement. Reaching and repeatedly using the rising star cave system, whatever the purpose requires, spatial familiarity with a demanding underground environment. None of this proves human-like language symbolism or ritual. It does show that behavior cannot be reconstructed by measuring cranial capacity alone. The broader African context becomes more complicated at exactly the same time. Around 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens populations are present in northern and eastern Africa. Other archaic forms remain difficult to classify. Some fossils traditionally assigned to Homo heidelbergensis, Homo rhodesiensis, or other categories may represent distinct populations or stages within broader regional lineages. Genetic evidence from living Africans also suggests that ancient population structure was deep and persistent. Some studies detect signals that may represent admixture with unidentified archaic populations, although the exact interpretation of these genetic patterns remains debated. Homo naledi could theoretically be one of many such African lineages, but there is currently no ancient DNA securely linking it to modern populations. Warm conditions destroy genetic material quickly, and no usable genome has yet emerged from the fossils. Without DNA, scientists rely on anatomy, geological dating, and archaeological context to understand its position. This limitation leaves one of the most intriguing possibilities unresolved: whether Homo naledi ever encountered Homo sapiens directly. The dates make some degree of chronological overlap plausible. Geographic overlap is harder to establish. Africa is enormous, and human populations can coexist for tens of thousands of years without meeting if they occupy different regions. Still, ecological corridors open and close as rainfall changes. Rivers shift, grasslands expand, forests contract, populations move. Even rare encounters could have consequences that the fossil record would struggle to preserve. This uncertainty is important because Homo naledi reminds us not to imagine Africa as a simple launching point from which modern humans depart while all other forms have already vanished. The continent itself may remain a mosaic of human populations well into the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens. The story of our species begins among diversity, not after diversity has ended. Eventually, however, Homo sapiens begins expanding farther beyond Africa. These movements do not occur as one enormous migration wave sweeping cleanly across the world. They happen repeatedly, with some expansions failing and others leaving descendants. Groups follow coastlines, river valleys, grassland corridors, and routes opened by favorable climates. Each movement carries people into territories already known by other humans. Somewhere beyond the next range of hills, another fire may already be burning. The people around it may have heavier faces, different bodies, unfamiliar tools, and ancestors separated from the newcomers for hundreds of thousands of years. For the first time in this story, the branches that have developed apart begin converging on the same landscapes. The meeting does not begin with a single migration, a single border crossing, or one dramatic moment when two kinds of humans suddenly discover that they are not alone. It unfolds across thousands of years and enormous distances. Homo sapiens has been moving within Africa throughout its history, responding to shifting rainfall, changing vegetation, expanding deserts, and temporary corridors into neighboring regions. At different times, small populations push beyond the continent. Some leave traces in the Levant, and then disappear from the archaeological record. Others may contribute little or nothing to later populations. Eventually, however, expansions beginning more than 60,000 years ago become part of a much larger dispersal across Eurasia, bringing Homo sapiens into landscapes occupied by human relatives whose ancestors separated from theirs hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The Levant forms one of the most important gateways. Here, Africa meets Eurasia through a narrow geographical corridor shaped by Mediterranean coastlines, deserts, mountains, and river systems. Fossils show Homo sapiens present in the region well before the later expansion that ultimately contributes most ancestry to populations outside Africa today. Neanderthals also occupy the Levant at various times. Their presence alternates with that of Homo sapiens as climates change. During wetter periods, grasslands and woodlands expand, making movement easier. During dry phases, deserts strengthen barriers. The region becomes less a permanent frontier between two species than a shifting ecological doorway used by different populations at different times. Sites such as School and Kafse preserve early Homo sapiens in the Levant more than 90,000 years ago, with some estimates extending farther back, depending on the specimen and dating method. Yet these populations do not appear to lead straightforwardly to the later widespread settlement of Eurasia. Neanderthals later occupy parts of the same broad region. This repeated turnover reveals an important truth. Leaving Africa is not the same as successfully colonizing an entire continent. Early expansions can contract, become isolated, merge with other groups, or vanish. Later, Homo sapiens populations spread farther. Some move along southern Asian routes, others through interior corridors, and the precise timing and pathways remain debated. What is increasingly clear is that Eurasia is already inhabited. Modern humans are not entering a vacant wilderness. In Western Eurasia, Neanderthal populations possess detailed knowledge of local environments, built across countless generations. In Asia, Denisovan-related groups occupy territories whose full extent is still unknown. Farther southeast, isolated lineages persist on islands. The newcomers therefore enter an ancient human geography. Archaeology rarely preserves the first encounter itself. Two groups might see smoke rising from a distant valley before ever seeing one another. Tracks around a water source could reveal that unfamiliar humans are nearby. A recently abandoned camp might contain stone flakes produced in a different style. Hunting territories could overlap gradually. Encounters might occur between a handful of individuals rather than entire communities. Nothing about the evidence requires meetings to resemble confrontations between organized peoples with fixed borders. The differences between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals would nevertheless have been visible. Neanderthals tend to be more heavily built with distinctive facial anatomy and powerful bodies. Homo sapiens generally possess more gracile skeletons, higher rounded brain cases, reduced brow ridges, and prominent chins. Clothing and body decoration where present may have amplified cultural differences far beyond anatomy. Languages or communication systems could have differed profoundly, although no direct evidence allows their sounds to be reconstructed. Yet they are not so biologically different that reproduction is impossible. This becomes one of the most important discoveries in the entire story, but even before genetics proves it, archaeology begins showing that the boundary between populations is not always simple. In regions where Neanderthals disappear and Homo sapiens appear, changes in tool traditions can be difficult to assign neatly to one group. Certain industries associated with the transition contain combinations of techniques that have fueled long debates about who produced them and whether ideas moved between populations. The shuttle Peronian of Western Europe is a famous example. It includes stone technologies alongside ornaments and worked bone objects at some sites, and has often been associated with Neanderthal remains. If Neanderthals made these objects, one possibility is that they independently developed increasingly elaborate cultural practices. Another is that contact with Homo sapiens encouraged technological borrowing or imitation. Archaeological layers can be disturbed, however, and scholars continue debating particular associations. The broader issue remains unresolved. When populations meet, artifacts do not always reveal whether ideas were invented, copied, exchanged, or carried by migrating people. Homo sapiens also brings technologies that become increasingly visible across Upper Paleolithic Eurasia. Blade production, bone and antler tools, ornaments, long-distance movement of materials, and eventually spectacular figurative art appear in many regions, though not all arrive simultaneously or belong exclusively to one population. Modern humans may maintain broader social networks, connecting groups over greater distances. If so, such networks could provide resilience during local shortages by allowing information mates raw materials and resources to move between communities. This has been proposed as one potential advantage over more isolated Neanderthal populations, but the scale of the difference remains debated. Population size may matter as much as technology. Genetic evidence indicates that Neanderthal groups are often small and experience substantial inbreeding. Homo sapiens entering Eurasia may also initially exist in small numbers, but expanding networks can create demographic momentum. Even a slight difference in average population growth, survival, or connectivity becomes enormous when repeated across thousands of years. Replacement does not require constant warfare. One population can gradually occupy more territory, while another becomes fragmented into shrinking refuges. Still, competition is difficult to avoid entirely when humans depend on similar resources. Both hunt large mammals. Both need reliable water, shelter, fuel, stone, and access to seasonal landscapes. A productive valley occupied by one group cannot always support another simultaneously. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals may therefore compete indirectly even without frequent violence. If one group uses prey more efficiently, maintains larger exchange networks, or recovers faster after ecological crises, the balance can slowly shift. Direct conflict is possible, but archaeological proof is scarce. Human bones from prehistory sometimes preserve traumatic injuries, yet identifying the attacker is usually impossible. A wound inflicted by another member of the same population looks much like one inflicted by a different human group. Popular images of Homo sapiens armies exterminating Neanderthals go far beyond what the evidence can support. No continent-wide battlefield records such a campaign. Disease offers another possibility. Populations separated for hundreds of thousands of years may carry different pathogens and immune adaptations. Contact could expose each group to infections for which the other has limited resistance. Models of ancient disease exchange have been proposed, but pathogens rarely leave obvious traces in skeletal remains, making this explanation difficult to test. It may have mattered without ever becoming the sole cause of disappearance. Climate adds pressure to everything else. Around the period when Homo sapiens expands across Eurasia and Neanderthals approach extinction, environmental conditions fluctuate sharply. Rapid cold phases alter vegetation and animal ranges. Habitats fragment. A small population already living near its demographic limit can be pushed into crisis when prey shifts or familiar landscapes disappear. Homo sapiens does not cause these climatic events, but its arrival may introduce an additional competitor precisely when some Neanderthal populations are least able to absorb new pressure, and yet the most important interactions are not necessarily hostile. Somewhere in Eurasia, individuals from these long-separated populations become partners and have children. This happens more than once. Similar encounters occur between Homo sapiens and Denisovan-related populations. The children survive, reproduce, and carry pieces of one lineage into another. Those encounters leave almost no visible archaeological signature. A campsite cannot easily reveal that one child has a Neanderthal mother and a Homo sapiens father. A stone tool does not record the ancestry of the hand that shaped it. For tens of thousands of years, the evidence remains hidden inside molecules. When ancient genomes finally become readable, the supposed boundary between modern humans and their lost cousins begins to dissolve. The vanished populations have not disappeared completely. Part of them has been travelling with us all along. For most of the 20th century, the disappearance of Neanderthals seems to offer a relatively simple ending. Homo sapiens enters Europe, Neanderthals vanish, and the two populations are treated as separate branches whose evolutionary relationship ends with replacement. Their bones can be compared and their tools examined, but the dead appear genetically silent. Then ancient DNA begins surviving the journey from prehistoric bone to modern laboratory, and the clean boundary collapses. The revelation is not merely that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals encountered one another. Their descendants are still alive. Recovering DNA from fossils tens of thousands of years old is extraordinarily difficult. After death, genetic material breaks into increasingly small fragments. Water heat microorganisms and chemical reactions damage it further. Ancient bones are also easily contaminated by modern human DNA, from excavators, museum workers, and researchers. Early attempts, therefore, face enormous technical obstacles. Cold environments provide better preservation, and improved sequencing methods eventually make it possible to reconstruct substantial portions of Neanderthal genomes from carefully selected fossils. When a draft Neanderthal genome is published in 2010, comparisons with living humans reveal a pattern that cannot be explained by simple separation. People whose ancestry lies largely outside sub-Saharan Africa generally share more genetic variants with Neanderthals than many populations whose ancestry remained primarily within Africa. The most straightforward explanation is ancient interbreeding, after some Homo sapiens populations leave Africa and encounter Neanderthals in Eurasia. Later population movements have complicated the geographic pattern, and Neanderthal-derived ancestry also exists in Africa today, partly because of migrations back into the continent. But the central conclusion remains the population's mixed. For many living people, roughly 1 to 2% of the genome can be traced to Neanderthal ancestry, although the exact amount differs among individuals and populations. This does not mean every person carries the same Neanderthal fragments. One individual may inherit a particular segment that another lacks. Across all living populations, researchers can therefore identify a much larger portion of the Neanderthal genome distributed in scattered pieces among different people. The percentage also understates the importance of the original encounters. Genetic models suggest that the first generations descended from interbreeding carried much more Neanderthal ancestry. Over thousands of generations, natural selection removes many archaic variants, particularly those that reduce reproductive success in the Homo sapiens genetic background. Other segments disappear through random genetic drift. What remains today is only a filtered remnant of a much larger initial contribution. The encounters occur more than once. An early modern human discovered at Peștera Uas in Romania, dating to roughly 40,000 years ago, possesses unusually long stretches of Neanderthal DNA. Their length indicates that a Neanderthal ancestor lived only a few generations earlier. This individual therefore comes from a family in which the meeting between the two populations is not some remote event lost hundreds of generations in the past. It is recent enough that the Neanderthal ancestor could almost belong to living family memory, yet the OS individual does not appear to have contributed substantial ancestry to later Europeans, reminding us that many prehistoric populations leave no major descendants. Human migration resembles a web of expansions and dead ends, rather than an uninterrupted march toward the present. Other early Homo sapiens genomes show Neanderthal ancestry from different episodes. By examining the lengths and distributions of inherited segments, geneticists estimate that a major period of admixture affecting the ancestors of many living non-African populations occurred tens of thousands of years ago, probably somewhere in Western Asia or neighboring regions. Additional encounters likely happen later. East Asian populations, for example, often carry somewhat more Neanderthal ancestry than Europeans, a pattern that may reflect additional admixture, demographic history, or both. Scholars still debate the precise number and location of these events. Denisovan ancestry tells an even more geographically complicated story. Living Papuan and some other Oceanian populations carry especially substantial Denisovan-related ancestry, while smaller contributions occur in various Asian populations. Genetic differences among these inherited segments suggest that Homo sapiens did not meet only one uniform Denisovan population. There were probably multiple encounters with Denisovan-related groups that had themselves been separated for long periods. This is remarkable because the fossils remain so scarce. Modern genomes effectively reveal ancient populations that archaeology has barely found. Somewhere in prehistoric Asia, Homo sapiens meets Denisovan-related humans, whose bones may still lie undiscovered, or may have dissolved completely in acidic tropical soils. The descendants of those meetings move onward, eventually crossing the formidable water barriers toward New Guinea and Australia, while carrying Denisovan DNA with them. Ancient DNA from Denisova Cave makes the intimacy of this tangled world impossible to ignore. Denisova 11, the young female whose bone fragment was found there, has a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. The genetic distinction between the groups is real, yet it does not prevent them from having viable offspring. Her Denisovan father also possesses Neanderthal ancestry from an older encounter. The family tree is already braided before she's born. Genetics even reveals that Neanderthals received genes from Homo sapiens-related populations before the major expansion of modern humans across Eurasia. Earlier movements out of Africa may have reached Neanderthal populations and contributed ancestry, without leaving large surviving Homo sapiens populations of their own. Gene flow therefore travels in multiple directions. Modern humans are not simply collecting DNA from archaic groups as they expand. Earlier Homo sapiens-related populations also leave genetic traces inside Neanderthals. This complexity makes the word species useful but imperfect. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens are clearly distinguishable evolutionary populations with long periods of independent history. Yet reproductive isolation is incomplete. They are capable of producing at least some fertile descendants. That does not make them identical populations, nor does occasional interbreeding erase hundreds of thousands of years of divergence. Nature simply does not always respect the clean boxes created for classification. Not all hybrid descendants fare equally well. One revealing pattern is the relative scarcity of Neanderthal ancestry in certain regions of the modern human genome, particularly around some genes involved in reproduction. This suggests that some genetic combinations may have reduced fertility or survival, especially in male descendants. Natural selection gradually removes these combinations. Other archaic variants are retained because they are neutral or in certain environments useful. The encounters themselves remain invisible as human experiences. Genetics can estimate when interbreeding occurred, but cannot tell whether relationships lasted for years or moments, whether individuals were welcomed into unfamiliar groups, whether partners shared language, or whether some encounters involved coercion. There was almost certainly no single pattern. Contact occurred across different places and generations, and prehistoric human behavior was likely as variable as human behavior has always been. What genetics does establish is that replacement was never complete in the simplest sense. Some Neanderthals and Denisovans became ancestors of Homo sapiens populations. Their communities disappeared as distinct populations, but portions of their genomes crossed the boundary and survived. Those inherited fragments are not merely historical labels. Some interact with immune responses, others influence skin biology, metabolism, blood characteristics, and adaptation to environmental conditions. Many have little obvious effect, while some archaic variants once advantageous in prehistoric environments may interact less favorably with modern lifestyles. Establishing those effects requires caution, because traits usually involve many genes interacting with environment. Still, one Denisovan-derived genetic adaptation stands above the rest for its dramatic connection between deep prehistory and living survival. High on the Tibetan plateau, where thin air places the human body under constant stress, people carry an inherited solution connected to a population that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. The lost cousins are no longer only beside us in the ancient landscape, they are beginning to appear within us. The inheritance left by extinct humans is scattered through living genomes in fragments so small that no one can feel them, and no face can be identified as belonging to a lost species. Yet some of these fragments continue to influence how modern bodies respond to altitude pathogens, sunlight, metabolism, and other pressures. The effects are not simple, and scientists must be careful not to turn every genetic association into an evolutionary story. Most traits emerge from many genes interacting with environment, and many archaic variants have little measurable consequence. Even so, a growing body of evidence shows that interbreeding did more than leave a historical signature. In certain places, genes inherited from ancient cousins became useful tools for survival. The clearest example is found high on the Tibetan plateau, at elevations where oxygen levels fall dramatically low. Land populations often struggle with chronic hypoxia. The body may respond by producing more red blood cells, but excessive thickening of the blood creates its own dangers. Tibetan populations show a distinctive physiological response that allows many individuals to live and reproduce at high altitude without relying on the same degree of elevated hemoglobin seen in some other mountain populations. One of the strongest genetic associations involves IPAS1, a gene connected to the body's response to low oxygen. The unusual version of IPAS1 common among Tibetans is closely related to genetic material found in Denisovans. The most plausible explanation is ancient introgression. Homo sapiens ancestors interbred with a Denisovan-related population, inherited the variant, and later natural selection increased its frequency because it provided an advantage at high altitude. This is especially striking because Denisovan-related humans themselves occupied the Tibetan plateau, long before modern populations established their later presence there. The Jiahi jaw and other evidence from Baixia Karst cave show that these archaic humans were already surviving in thin air. A biological solution shaped in one human lineage appears to have crossed into another. The sequence of events may have been gradual. Homo sapiens encounters Denisovan-related populations somewhere in Asia. Descendants inherit numerous archaic DNA fragments. Most drift away or are selected against. A small number persist. When later populations move into high-altitude environments, the EPAS1-related variant becomes particularly valuable. Generation after generation, people carrying it leave slightly more surviving descendants. Eventually, a genetic fragment that once belonged to an extinct population becomes common among living highland communities. This process is known as adaptive introgression, and it offers one of the clearest demonstrations that interbreeding can accelerate adaptation. Evolution does not always have to wait for a useful mutation to arise independently. If a neighboring population has already spent thousands of generations adapting to a difficult environment, mixing with that population can transfer useful variants almost immediately in evolutionary terms. Neanderthal ancestry appears to have influenced modern humans in similar, though often more complicated, ways. Neanderthals survive across Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years before the major expansion of Homo sapiens into many of the same environments. During that time, they encounter local pathogens, seasonal climates, lower ultraviolet radiation, and food resources different from those faced by many African populations. When Homo sapiens interbreeds with them, some inherited variants may provide advantages in these unfamiliar conditions. Genes involved in immunity are among the most studied. Certain archaic variants associated with toll-like receptors and other immune pathways appear to influence how the body recognizes pathogens. In prehistoric Eurasia, acquiring immune-related variants from populations already adapted to local disease environments could have been beneficial. Yet immune systems involve trade-offs. A stronger response to infection can also increase the risk of inflammatory or allergic reactions. Some archaic variants associated with past survival advantages are therefore linked in modern studies to heighten sensitivity or disease susceptibility under present conditions. This does not mean Neanderthal DNA makes a person generally healthier or less healthy. Selection operates on particular variants in particular environments. A genetic change that helps an Ice Age population survive recurrent infections may become neutral in another setting, or disadvantageous in a modern environment shaped by different diets. Medicine-reduced pathogen exposure and longer lifespans. Skin and hair biology also contain archaic contributions. Moving into northern Eurasia exposes Homo sapiens to different levels of ultraviolet radiation and seasonal sunlight. Several Neanderthal-derived genetic variants influence keratin-related proteins and aspects of pigmentation. Researchers have proposed that some provided benefits in colder or lower light environments, although pigmentation is highly polygenic and varied among both Neanderthals and modern humans. The popular image of all Neanderthals sharing a single complexion or hair color is therefore misleading. Genetic evidence suggests variation existed within their populations as well. Other inherited segments have been associated with metabolism, fat storage, blood clotting, circadian rhythms, and responses to environmental stress. These findings are often statistically complex. A variant may correlate with a trait in one modern population, but have different effects depending on other genes or lifestyle. Scholars still debate the evolutionary significance of many individual associations, and some early claims have weakened as larger datasets become available. The broader pattern, however, remains secure. Archaic DNA did not survive entirely by accident. Some of it survived because it worked. At the same time, much archaic ancestry was removed. The modern human genome contains regions unusually depleted of Neanderthal DNA, indicating that natural selection acted against certain inherited variants. Genetic incompatibilities can develop when populations remain separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Each lineage accumulates mutations that function adequately within its own genetic background, but may interact poorly when combined with genes from another population. The X chromosome contains less Neanderthal ancestry than many autosomal regions, and genomic regions as associated with male reproductive function show particularly strong depletion. This pattern has been interpreted as evidence that some male hybrids experienced reduced fertility. The effect would not need to make all hybrids sterile. Even a modest reduction in reproductive success could gradually eliminate incompatible variants across thousands of generations. This creates an important distinction. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans can interbreed, but interbreeding does not mean there are no biological boundaries. Their separation is incomplete rather than non-existent. Some gene combinations cross successfully and survive to the present. Others are removed almost immediately in evolutionary terms. Random chance also shapes what remains. Prehistoric populations are small. A useful variant can disappear if its carriers die without descendants. A neutral fragment can become common simply because a small founding group happens to carry it. Population bottlenecks magnify these effects. As Homo sapiens groups move across continents, cross water barriers, or settle isolated regions, only a fraction of the genetic diversity of their source populations travels with them. This makes the archaic inheritance visible today uneven. Individuals from different regions carry different combinations of Neanderthal-derived fragments. Denisovan-related ancestry is particularly concentrated in populations whose ancestors moved through parts of Southeast Asia and Oceania. The pattern acts almost like a genetic map of prehistoric encounters, though later migration continually redraws it. There may also be ancestry from human populations that have not yet been identified in the fossil record. Genetic studies of African populations sometimes recover signals consistent with deep population structure or possible admixture from archaic groups. Interpreting these signals is difficult because ancient African population history itself is highly structured, and patterns that resemble archaic introgression can sometimes arise without interbreeding with a separate species. No single explanation fully accounts for every data set. Still, the possibility that additional lost populations contributed to living genomes remains active. The human body, therefore, becomes an archive alongside caves and fossil beds. A piece of bone can reveal the existence of a Denisovan individual, but a genetic variant carried by millions of living people can reveal the long survival of a Denisovan inheritance. The extinction of a population does not necessarily erase its evolutionary experiments. This makes the disappearance of the ancient cousins more complicated than the word extinction suggests. Some are replaced, some may be absorbed, some genetic lineages persist while the communities that carried them vanish. A species can disappear from the landscape while pieces of its biology continue traveling through another population, but inherited DNA explains survival only after contact. It does not explain why the populations that contributed it stop existing as recognizable groups. By roughly 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals are disappearing from their final known territories. Denisovan populations eventually vanish as distinct lineages. Island humans fade from the record. Climate, demography, competition, disease, and assimilation all remain on the table. The mystery is not simply why one species won. It is why an ancient world filled with multiple kinds of humans became a world containing only one. The disappearance is easiest to imagine as a dramatic event, the last Neanderthal standing at the entrance of a cave while unfamiliar humans spread across the valley below, or the final island family watching new arrivals approach a distant shore. The archaeological record offers nothing so convenient. Extinction rarely leaves a final scene. Instead, populations become harder to find. Occupation layers grow younger and then stop. Genetic diversity contracts. Familiar technologies disappear from particular regions. Fossils become increasingly scarce until the record falls silent. By the time silence is obvious, the people who created it have already been gone for thousands of years. Neanderthals provide the best evidence because their fossils and archaeological sites are far more numerous than those of Denisovans or the island lineages. Their disappearance occurs broadly around 40,000 years ago, although the precise timing varies between regions and individual dates remain subject to revision. Homo sapiens is spreading through Europe during roughly the same broad period. The overlap is impossible to ignore, but turning correlation into a single cause has proved much more difficult. Climate once seemed like an obvious explanation. Neanderthals lived through the unstable world of the Pleistocene, when abrupt changes can transform vegetation and prey communities over surprisingly short periods. Around their final millennia, Eurasia experiences severe climatic fluctuations. Cold and dry phases fragment forests and alter productive habitats. Herds move. Local ecosystems collapse or reorganize. A population dependent on detailed knowledge of a particular landscape can suddenly find that knowledge less useful when the landscape itself changes. Yet Neanderthals have survived climatic instability before. They endure repeated glacial and interglacial cycles across hundreds of thousands of years. Climate alone therefore struggles to explain why they disappear precisely when another human population is expanding into their territories. It may instead have weakened already small communities, making other pressures more consequential. Population size is one of the strongest candidates. Genetic evidence suggests that many Neanderthal groups are remarkably small and isolated. Some genomes reveal long stretches of identical DNA inherited from closely related ancestors, indicating substantial inbreeding. This does not mean every Neanderthal community consists of immediate relatives, but their broader population networks appear limited compared with the enormous interconnected populations of the modern world. Small populations face mathematical dangers that have nothing to do with intelligence. If only a few women of reproductive age live within reachable territory, random deaths can alter the future of an entire group. A hunting accident, difficult winter epidemic, or series of unsuccessful births can push a community below recovery. If neighbouring groups are also sparse, there may be too few migrants to restore numbers or genetic diversity. Computer models demonstrate how surprisingly little difference may be required. If Homo sapiens populations possess even slightly higher fertility, lower infant mortality, broader exchange networks, or greater movement between groups, they can gradually become more numerous while Neanderthal populations decline. There need not be a sudden technological revolution or deliberate extermination. A demographic advantage repeated across hundreds of generations can transform a continent. Social connectivity may contribute to that advantage. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Homo sapiens communities move raw materials across substantial distances and maintain networks expressed through ornaments and shared technologies. These connections can provide more than decorative objects. They can help people find mates beyond the immediate group, exchange information about distant resources, and seek support when local conditions deteriorate. Neanderthals also transport materials and maintain social connections, so the difference should not be exaggerated. The debate concerns scale and resilience rather than the presence or absence of social life. Dietary flexibility may matter as well. Both populations hunt large mammals, and Neanderthals are highly competent predators. Homo sapiens, however, may in some regions exploit a broader combination of small game aquatic resources, plants, birds, and fish. Archaeological preservation can bias this comparison, and Neanderthal diets themselves vary considerably. Still, when environments become unstable, even a modestly broader resource base could reduce risk. Technology provides another possible edge. Later Homo sapiens assemblages often contain diverse projectile technologies, bone tools, needles, and other equipment. Some of these technologies may improve hunting efficiency, clothing production, or the ability to occupy extreme environments. Yet there is no single artifact that explains Neanderthal extinction. Technological traditions overlap. Ideas may have passed between populations, and Neanderthals themselves produced sophisticated tools. The image of advanced modern humans confronting technologically helpless Neanderthals is unsupported. Direct violence remains possible but difficult to quantify. Humans compete violently with other humans throughout recorded history, and prehistoric populations are unlikely to have been universally peaceful. Neanderthal and Homo sapiens groups competing for the same valley could certainly clash. Skeletal trauma shows that violence existed, but it rarely identifies the ancestry of the attacker. There is no evidence for a coordinated campaign of extermination across Eurasia. Local conflict may contribute without being the dominant mechanism. Disease is similarly plausible and elusive. Long-separated populations can carry different infectious organisms. When contact occurs, pathogens can move into groups with limited immunity. Homo sapiens arriving from Africa and southern Eurasia might introduce diseases unfamiliar to Neanderthals, while Neanderthals could transmit Eurasian pathogens to newcomers. Genetic adaptations involving immunity suggest disease has long shaped human evolution, but ancient epidemics are notoriously difficult to detect. The hypothesis remains possible rather than demonstrated. Then there is assimilation. Neanderthals do not need to die without descendants for Neanderthals to disappear as a population. If their communities are small and Homo sapiens groups increasingly numerous, repeated interbreeding can gradually absorb individuals into the expanding population. A Neanderthal group might lose members through partnership or migration into neighboring Homo sapiens communities. Their children carry mixed ancestry. Over generations, the distinctive population identity disappears even though some genes survive. Genetic evidence proves that assimilation happens at least occasionally. Whether it accounts for a substantial portion of the final disappearance remains debated. The relatively low percentage of Neanderthal ancestry in living humans suggests that complete absorption cannot be the whole story, but natural selection and genetic drift have also removed large amounts of archaic ancestry since the original encounters. Extinction and assimilation are not mutually exclusive. Different Neanderthal communities may experience different endings. For Denisovans, the problem is harder because their geographic range is poorly mapped. Genetic evidence suggests multiple Denisovan-related populations across Asia, but fossils remain rare. Some groups interbreed with Homo sapiens and leave substantial ancestry in later Oceanian populations. Others may disappear independently. Environmental change, competition, population, absorption, and demographic fragility could all play roles, but the evidence is too thin to reconstruct a single Denisovan decline. The island lineages are even more vulnerable to local catastrophe. Homo floresiensis exists within a restricted ecosystem where volcanic eruptions, prey decline, or environmental change can affect the entire population. Homo sapiens reaches the wider region near the period when Homo floresiensis disappears from the known record, but direct causation has not been demonstrated. The same caution applies to Homo luzonensis. A small isolated population can vanish for reasons that leave almost no recognizable signature. What emerges is not one extinction mechanism, but a dangerous convergence. Climate changes habitats. Small populations struggle to recover. New humans arrive. Resources become more contested. Diseases may move between groups. Technologies and social networks differ. Interbreeding absorbs some individuals. Random events finish communities already close to demographic collapse. No single explanation fully accounts for this across every region, because there may never have been a single explanation. The lost cousins are not one population undergoing one catastrophe. They are different humans living across continents and islands, each with its own history. This changes the meaning of Homo sapiens expansion. It is tempting to tell the story as victory, a superior species arrives and defeats inferior rivals. The evidence points towards something less dramatic and more unsettling. Survival may depend on tiny demographic advantages, accidents of geography, shifting climates, inherited technologies, social connections, and chance. A lineage can flourish for hundreds of thousands of years and still disappear when several pressures overlap. And the closer the final centuries are examined, the less the boundary resembles a war between completely separate worlds. Neanderthals burrow, innovate, migrate, and sometimes have children with the newcomers. Homo sapiens enters landscapes already shaped by other humans. The transition is not merely competition. It is contact, exchange, absorption, and loss happening at the same time. If competition were the entire story, the archaeological record should become cleaner as Homo sapiens spreads. One population would arrive with its own technologies and behaviors, another would retreat with theirs, and the boundary between them would move across the landscape like a visible frontier. Instead, the final millennia of coexistence are filled with ambiguity. Tools appear whose makers are disputed. Ornaments emerge in contexts associated with Neanderthals. Genetic evidence records repeated interbreeding. Different populations occupy the same regions at different moments, sometimes separated by centuries, sometimes perhaps close enough in time for direct contact. The ancient world does not look like two armies advancing toward a decisive confrontation. It looks like small communities repeatedly entering one another's worlds. This distinction matters because prehistoric populations do not operate at the scale of modern states. A Neanderthal group may contain only a few dozen people. A nearby Homo sapiens group may be similarly small. Neither possesses maps showing the continental distribution of its species. They know rivers, hunting grounds, cave stone sources, neighboring families, and perhaps distant groups connected through seasonal movement. When two populations meet, they are not representatives negotiating on behalf of Neanderthals and modern humans. They are individuals confronting unfamiliar individuals. The archaeological evidence for cultural exchange remains difficult to interpret, but several sites preserve intriguing possibilities. The Châtelperronian industries of France and northern Spain contain stone tools that differ in important ways from classic Mousterian traditions. At some sites, bone tools, pendants, and ornaments occur in association with deposits linked to Neanderthals. If those associations are secure, they demonstrate behaviors once assumed to belong only to Homo sapiens. One interpretation holds that Neanderthals adopt certain technologies or symbolic practices after encountering incoming modern humans. Another proposes independent Neanderthal innovation. A third possibility is that archaeological layers have become mixed, or that some artifacts were made by Homo sapiens. Scholars still debate individual sites, and there is no reason to assume the same explanation applies everywhere. What the controversy itself reveals is that the behavioral boundary between populations is less obvious than older narratives suggested. Other discoveries push Neanderthal behavior deeper into time before extensive contact with Homo sapiens in Western Europe. Pigments, modified shells, possible ornaments, and unusual constructions appear at sites whose dates may precede the arrival of modern humans in those regions. In Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France, broken stalagmites were arranged into large structures deep underground more than 170,000 years ago. Neanderthals are the only known humans in the region at that time. The purpose of the constructions remains unknown, but reaching the chamber requires controlled lighting and deliberate movement far from daylight. Whatever happened there does not fit comfortably with the idea of Neanderthals restricted to simple subsistence behavior. This does not mean Neanderthal and Homo sapiens cultures were identical. Differences in technology, social organization, communication, mobility, and symbolic behavior may have been important. but differences do not necessarily imply a hierarchy in which every modern human behavior is superior. Cultural systems evolve around particular environments and social networks. A technology useful to a highly mobile population may provide little advantage to a group exploiting the same valley intensively for generations. Raw materials reveal some of these networks. Stone found far from its geological source can show how people moved or exchanged objects. Homo sapiens sites sometimes display materials transported over long distances, suggesting connections spanning broad regions. Neanderthal sites also contain non-local stone, although average transport distances in some contexts may be shorter. If modern human networks were generally wider, this could help explain demographic resilience. A group suffering local scarcity might maintain connections to communities beyond the immediate crisis. Those connections also move ideas. A new method of shaping bone sewing hides hunting animals or decorating the body can spread without the people who invented it moving very far. Archaeologists therefore face a persistent problem. An artifact can reveal that an idea exists but not necessarily the ancestry of the person who first conceived it. Genetics provides stronger evidence for movement between communities. The repeated appearance of Neanderthal ancestry in Homo sapiens genomes shows that some social boundary was crossed often enough to leave descendants. Denisova 11 proves the same directly for Neanderthals and Denisovans. These encounters could involve individuals joining neighboring groups, temporary partnerships, or communities merging during periods of low population. The evidence cannot specify the social circumstances. Assimilation becomes especially important when populations differ greatly in size. Imagine a region containing several small Neanderthal groups and a slowly increasing number of Homo sapiens communities. If even a few Neanderthal individuals join the larger population each generation, the effect is asymmetrical. Homo sapiens gains a small amount of Neanderthal ancestry without losing its broader demographic identity. The Neanderthal population, already small, loses a meaningful fraction of its reproductive population. Over centuries, such a process can make a lineage disappear without requiring its members to be killed. The descendants remain alive, but their ancestry becomes diluted within a larger population. Natural selection later removes some inherited DNA while drift removes more. Tens of thousands of years afterward, the surviving genetic percentage looks small, even though assimilation may once have involved many individuals. This possibility changes the emotional shape of extinction. The final Neanderthals may not all have died among other Neanderthals. Some could have become grandparents within mixed communities. Their children might grow up learning technologies and social traditions from both sides. Within a few generations, distinctions that appear obvious to modern paleoanthropologists may have become less meaningful locally. That scenario remains partly inferential. Archaeology cannot identify the cultural identity of most mixed ancestry individuals, and genetics cannot recover every population that once existed. Still, it fits the evidence better than a model in which the two groups remain absolutely separate until one suddenly disappears. The same principle may apply even more strongly to Denisovan-related populations. Modern humans moving through Asia repeatedly acquire Denisovan ancestry. Some inherited segments become common in later populations. Because Denisovan fossils are scarce, entire episodes of contact are visible only genetically. There may have been regions where Homo sapiens and Denisovan-related humans coexist for generations, exchanging genes and perhaps technologies, without leaving any fossil currently recognized by science. Even language, although impossible to recover directly, deserves cautious consideration. Neanderthal anatomy and genetics indicate that they possessed much of the biological machinery relevant to speech and hearing, but this cannot reveal the complexity of their languages. Homo sapiens likely arrives with sophisticated communication systems of its own. If both populations use structured vocal communication, contact creates the possibility of learning, borrowing, and bilingual interaction, just as contact between human communities does today. The evidence cannot demonstrate this, but neither does it justify imagining encounters conducted only through gestures and violence. There is also no reason to expect every meeting to have the same outcome. Some groups may avoid one another, others compete over prey, some exchange objects or knowledge, some fight, some interbreed. Human relationships are variable even within a single culture, and prehistoric contact spanning thousands of years must have been at least as complicated. By the time Neanderthals disappear as a recognizable population, Homo sapiens has not simply entered an untouched continent. It has inherited landscapes mapped by generations of other humans, perhaps acquired useful genes from them, and possibly absorbed individuals who once belonged to those older communities. Yet absorption cannot preserve everything. Languages vanish, local knowledge disappears, traditions that leave no durable artifacts are lost completely. The genome records biological contact, but it cannot reconstruct songs, gestures, childhood games, hunting stories, or names for mountains. Most of what made these populations themselves disappears beyond recovery. As Homo sapiens expands, the remaining human diversity contracts towards scattered edges, peninsulas, mountain systems, distant islands, and ecological refuges where small populations can survive a little longer. These places become the final known territories of worlds that once stretched much farther. The disappearance is approaching its last visible refuges, and the archaeological record is about to become almost completely silent. As the territories occupied by different human populations contract, the map of their final survival becomes uneven. There is no single last refuge where every lost cousin gathers before disappearing. Instead, separate lineages persist in landscapes scattered across thousands of kilometers: Neanderthals in parts of Western Eurasia, Denisovan-related populations somewhere across Asia, small-bodied humans on Flores, and perhaps other groups whose final territories remain unidentified. Each population reaches the end of its known archaeological record differently. The dates are imperfect, the fossils sparse, and some supposed final refuge have moved backward in time as improved dating techniques exposed earlier errors. What remains is less a calendar of extinction than a series of fading signals. For Neanderthal, southwestern Europe once seemed to preserve the clearest final sanctuary. Caves in Gibraltar produced Mysterian tools, and Neanderthal remains encouraging an appealing picture of the last communities surviving beside the Mediterranean long after Homo sapiens had occupied much of Europe. Gorham's Cave became particularly famous in this interpretation. Its deep sequence records repeated prehistoric occupation, and the steep limestone cliffs surrounding Gibraltar offer caves, coastal resources, and varied habitats that could plausibly support isolated groups. Some early dates appeared to place Neanderthal-associated activity there surprisingly late, perhaps below 30,000 years ago. Later reassessment has made such claims less secure. Radiocarbon dating approaches its practical limits in this period, and even tiny amounts of younger contamination can make ancient samples appear thousands of years too recent. Improved pre-treatment and dating methods have shifted many supposedly late Neanderthal sites earlier. Most researchers now place Neanderthal disappearance broadly around 40,000 years ago, with regional variation and continued debate over particular sites. This correction reveals something important about extinction archaeology. Everyone wants to find the last survivor, but the youngest dated artifact is not automatically evidence for the final individual. Archaeological preservation is patchy, A population might persist somewhere without leaving remains that survive or have been discovered. Conversely, a contaminated date can create an illusion of survival long after a population is gone. The evidence remains incomplete, so the final Neanderthal generation cannot be located with certainty. What can be reconstructed is fragmentation. During their later history, Neanderthal populations appear increasingly divided. Genetic studies of late individuals reveal population turnover and movement, rather than one stable European community steadily shrinking in place. Some Neanderthal groups disappear and are replaced by other Neanderthals before Homo sapiens becomes dominant. This suggests that their demographic world is already unstable. Local extinction is not new. What changes is that vanished communities are eventually no longer replaced by other Neanderthal populations. The landscape itself keeps shifting beneath them. Rapid climatic oscillations alter forests, grasslands, and animal distributions. Regions productive for one generation may become less reliable within relatively short spans. Mobile hunter-gatherers can respond by moving, but movement becomes harder when neighboring territories are occupied or when suitable habitats become disconnected. Homo sapiens communities spreading through Europe add another population competing for the same ecological corridors. A refuge can therefore become a trap. Mountains, peninsulas, and isolated valleys may protect a population temporarily from competition or environmental change, but isolation also reduces access to mates and neighboring communities. Genetic diversity falls, knowledge networks contract. A single local disaster matters more. Survival at the edge of a species' range may prolong existence, while simultaneously making long-term recovery less likely. The Denisovan ending is far harder to visualize. Their known genetic history extends across enormous distances, but there is no equivalent of a well-mapped final Denisovan territory. Denisova Cave records repeated occupation by Denisovan-related individuals across long periods, yet the population represented there is only part of a much larger story. Genetic contributions to modern humans show that other Denisovan-related groups live farther south and east. Some may persist late enough to meet Homo sapiens moving through Southeast Asia. Exactly when Denisovans disappear as distinct populations remains unknown. The scarcity of fossils means there is no reliable final date comparable with the broad chronology available for Neanderthals. Their disappearance may not even occur everywhere at approximately the same time. If Denisovan-related populations are deeply divided, one group could vanish while another survives thousands of years longer. Some may be absorbed into expanding Homo sapiens populations rather than ending through straightforward demographic extinction. Flores offers different kind of final refuge. Homo floresiensis lives within an island ecosystem bounded by deep water. Liangbua preserves its remains until roughly 50,000 years ago, with associated archaeological evidence extending through a complicated sequence whose interpretation continues to be refined. Around the same broad period, Homo sapiens is moving through Wallacea towards Sahul. The temporal proximity is striking, but direct interaction remains unproven. Volcanism provides another potential source of disruption. Flores is geologically active and volcanic events repeatedly transform its ecosystems. Earlier faunal changes on the island coincide with major environmental disturbances, although connecting a specific eruption directly to the final extinction of Homo floresiensis remains difficult. A small population restricted to one island is inherently vulnerable. If a catastrophe destroys food resources across a large fraction of its territory, there may be nowhere else to go. Homo luzonensis leaves an even fainter ending. Its known fossils from Kalau Cave date to tens of thousands of years before the present, but the small sample cannot establish how long the population survives afterward. Modern humans eventually occupy Luzon, yet there is no archaeological layer preserving a confrontation between the two. The lineage simply disappears from the recognizable fossil record. This pattern repeats throughout human evolution. The last known fossil is almost never the actual last member of a population. It is merely the youngest individual fortunate enough to die, in circumstances where remains are preserved, buried, survive geological destruction, and are eventually discovered. Thousands of later individuals could theoretically have existed without leaving recoverable traces. That uncertainty has encouraged stories about archaic humans surviving into very recent times, sometimes linked to folklore about small forest people or mysterious mountain inhabitants. Such stories are culturally interesting, but connecting them directly to Homo floresiensis, Denisovans, or other extinct populations requires evidence that does not currently exist. Oral traditions can persist for long periods, yet demonstrating continuity across tens of thousands of years is extraordinarily difficult. Claims of living archaic humans today remain unsupported. The real story requires no hidden survivors. It is already strange enough. Around 50,000 years ago, several distinct human lineages still inhabit Earth. Within a relatively short span of evolutionary time, most disappear. By the later Upper Paleolithic, Homo sapiens increasingly becomes the only human species visible across enormous regions. But the process is not a clean wave moving from Africa outward. Populations vanish at different times. Some leave genes, some leave only bones. Others may leave genetic signals without identified fossils. Entire human groups could have existed in regions where preservation is poor and archaeological research remains limited. The final refugees are therefore not only geographical places, they are gaps in knowledge. A cave in Siberia preserves DNA because cold conditions protect it. Tropical forests may destroy equivalent evidence. A limestone chamber protects fragile bones while open landscapes erase them. The map of known human diversity is partly a map of where fossils happen to survive. That raises an unsettling possibility. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis and Homo naledi may not represent the full cast of late human evolution at all. They may simply be the branches fortunate enough to leave evidence recognizable to modern science. And within living genomes, researchers are beginning to find signs of others' populations with no agreed face, no confirmed skeleton, and no scientific name. The human family tree contains shadows between its known branches, and those shadows suggest that some lost cousins have not yet been discovered. Some extinct humans announce themselves through unmistakable bones. Neanderthals leave skulls, skeletons, tools, and occupation layers across much of Western Eurasia. Homo floresiensis emerges from a cave as a body strange enough to demand a new explanation. Denisovans reveal themselves more quietly first through DNA, extracted from a fragment that might otherwise have attracted little attention. But the deepest surprise of modern genetics is that even a fossil may not be necessary. A vanished population can leave descendants, and descendants can preserve evidence of ancestors whose bones have never been identified at all. Geneticists sometimes refer to these populations informally as ghost lineages. The term does not imply anything supernatural. It describes ancestral groups inferred from statistical patterns in genomes, rather than securely matched to known fossils. When populations separate, mutations gradually accumulate within each branch. If those branches later interbreed, descendants inherit blocks of DNA carrying traces of that earlier divergence. Over many generations, the blocks become shorter through recombination, but sophisticated comparisons can still detect unusual patterns of ancestry. Denisovans demonstrate that this method can work. Before their genome was sequenced, there was no recognized population waiting under that name. Genetic evidence effectively revealed them first. That success raises an obvious possibility other unidentified human groups may also be hiding within genomic data. Africa is especially important. The continent contains the deepest diversity within Homo sapiens and has supported human populations for far longer than any other inhabited region. Its prehistoric population structure is therefore enormously complicated. Groups repeatedly become separated by deserts, forests, climatic shifts, and distance, then reconnect when environmental corridors reopen. Such deep structure can produce genetic patterns that resemble admixture with an archaic lineage, making interpretation difficult. Several studies have nevertheless identified signals consistent with contributions from deeply diverged populations to the ancestors of some living Africans. Depending on the model used, these signals can be explained by admixture with an archaic population, by long-lasting structure among ancestral Homo sapiens groups, or by combinations of both. Scholars still debate which interpretation best fits the evidence. Without ancient genomes from the relevant populations, assigning the signal to a named species would be premature. This distinction matters because Africa contains fossils that are themselves difficult to classify. During the Middle and Late Pleistocene, different regions preserve humans with varying combinations of archaic and modern traits. Some may belong to populations closely related to the ancestors of Homo sapiens. Others may represent separate branches. Fossils, once placed conveniently into broad categories such as archaic Homo sapiens or Homo heidelbergensis, may conceal far more diversity than those labels suggest. Homo naledi provides a warning against assuming that unusual lineages must have disappeared early. Its anatomy looks primitive in several respects, yet it survives until a period when early Homo sapiens already exists. Other populations with similarly deep histories could have persisted elsewhere without yet being recognized. Tropical environments make the problem worse because heat and moisture destroy DNA rapidly and can damage bone itself. The regions most important for early human evolution are often among the least favorable for molecular preservation. Asia presents its own ghosts. Denisovan ancestry in living populations does not appear to derive from one simple source. Genetic analyses suggest multiple deeply separated Denisovan-related groups contributed to different Homo sapiens populations. The Denisovan sampled from Siberia may therefore represent only one branch within a much broader Eastern Eurasian radiation. This raises a tantalizing problem for the fossil record. Asia contains several archaic human fossils whose relationships remain disputed. Some Chinese Middle Pleistocene skulls combine features that have encouraged comparisons with Homo erectus Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens and Denisovans. Without recoverable DNA, assigning them confidently is difficult. It is possible that future protein analysis or genetic recovery will connect some of these fossils to Denisovan-related populations. It is equally possible that they represent additional branches. One fossil has already demonstrated the power of alternative molecular evidence. The Siahi mandible from the Tibetan plateau yielded ancient proteins that linked it closely to Denisovans, even when conventional ancient DNA was unavailable. Proteins generally survive longer than DNA under some conditions. Paleoproteomics may therefore provide identities for fossils that have remained taxonomically ambiguous for decades. Sediments offer another remarkable archive. Scientists can sometimes extract ancient hominin DNA directly from cave sediments, even when no recognizable human bone is present. Tiny biological traces from skin hair, bodily waste, or decomposed remains can become incorporated into sediment and survive under favorable conditions. At Denisova Cave and other sites, Sedimentary DNA has revealed occupations by Neanderthals or Denisovans in layers lacking diagnostic fossils. A cave floor can therefore preserve evidence of people who left no skeleton behind. These techniques are changing the scale of the search. Archaeologists once depended heavily on discovering visible human remains. Now a fragment of protein, a molecule in sediment, or an unusual stretch of DNA inside a living genome can expose an entire missing population. The human evolutionary record is becoming less dependent on the extraordinary accident of fossilization. Yet every new method also introduces uncertainty. Genetic models depend on assumptions about population size, mutation rates, migration, and separation. Different demographic histories can sometimes produce similar patterns. Protein evidence may identify broad relationships without resolving every branch. Sedimentary DNA can move between layers or become contaminated if contexts are not carefully controlled. New evidence expands the story, but it does not eliminate the need for caution. The concept of a ghost lineage is particularly vulnerable to sensationalism. A statistical signal does not automatically prove the existence of an unknown species. It may represent a population within Homo sapiens that remained separated for a long time. Species boundaries in human evolution are already difficult, and genetic divergence does not provide a simple threshold beyond which one population becomes another species. What matters is the broader pattern. Human populations repeatedly divide, survive in isolation, and reconnect. The named groups known today are unlikely to capture every branch involved. Some disappear without contributing descendants. Others contribute genes and vanish culturally. Some may be represented by fossils sitting in museum collections under uncertain labels. Still others may have left nothing that has yet been recognized. The geography of future discoveries is impossible to predict, but large portions of Africa and Asia remain comparatively underrepresented in the fossil record. Submerged landscapes create another enormous blind spot. During Ice Age periods, sea levels can stand more than 100 meters lower than today, exposing coastal plains where human populations live and migrate. When the glaciers melt, rising seas drown those landscapes. Campsites, burial places, and migration corridors now lie beneath continental shelves. Island Southeast Asia is especially transformed. Ancient coastlines connecting and separating populations differ dramatically from modern maps. Humans moving towards Sahul travel through landscapes partly submerged today. If encounters with Denisovan-related populations occur near those former coasts, some of the most important archaeological evidence may now lie underwater. The same problem exists around Europe, Africa, and Western Asia. Humans frequently favor coasts and river mouths, exactly the environments most vulnerable to later sea level rise. The surviving archaeological record is therefore biased toward inland and elevated locations. There may never be enough evidence to name every cousin who shared the planet with Homo sapiens. Some branches could remain permanently invisible. Their populations may have numbered only thousands. Their fossils may have dissolved. Their genetic contributions may have been lost through drift or selection. Entire histories can disappear without leaving a recoverable molecule. That possibility changes how the known species should be viewed. Neanderthals are not necessarily humanity's only close companions in the West, nor Denisovans a single mysterious counterpart in the East. Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis may represent only two visible examples of island diversity that was once broader. Homo naledi demonstrates how unexpectedly late an unusual lineage can survive in Africa. The ancient world begins to resemble a landscape filled with populations at different stages of separation and reunion, rather than a small collection of neatly defined species. By the time Homo sapiens becomes the only surviving human form, Much of that diversity has vanished beyond reconstruction. Yet enough remains in bones cave sediment proteins and living DNA to show that solitude is recent. For most of humanity's deeper history, being human did not mean belonging to the only human population on Earth. Our ancestors shared their world with others, and when those others disappeared, they left Homo sapiens not at the beginning of its story, but standing among the remains of a family far larger than anyone would remember. The world that Homo sapiens inherits does not suddenly become empty when the other human lineages disappear. Their camps remain beneath sediment. Their stone flakes lie beside extinct animal bones. Their hearths survive as thin bands of charcoal and reddened earth. Caves preserve teeth, fragments of skull, and occasional skeletons long after the names, languages, and memories attached to them have vanished. In some living populations, pieces of their genomes continue moving from parent to child. The lost cousins are gone as recognizable peoples, but the world after them is built partly from what they leave behind. This changes the meaning of human uniqueness. For generations, the survival of Homo sapiens was easily interpreted as evidence of inevitable superiority. Our species possessed language, imagination, technology, cooperation, or some decisive mental advantage that other humans supposedly lacked. Discoveries of the last several decades have made that explanation increasingly difficult to maintain in such a simple form. Neanderthals plan sophisticated stone production, control fire hunt. Dangerous animals care for injured individuals, use pigments, and sometimes manipulate objects that appear ornamental or symbolic. Denisovan-related populations adapt to environments as severe as the Tibetan Plateau. Homo floresiensis survives for extraordinary periods on an isolated island, despite a body and brain very different from ours. Homo naledi demonstrates that anatomical traits once placed on a straightforward evolutionary ladder can persist in unexpected combinations. None of this requires pretending that every human lineage possesses identical abilities. Homo sapiens eventually develops cultural networks of remarkable scale. Technologies accumulate rapidly in many later populations. Symbolic traditions become extraordinarily elaborate. People exchange materials over long distances, colonize environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical islands, and eventually transform ecosystems on a planetary scale. Some combination of cognition, communication, demographic, connectivity, flexibility, and culture almost certainly contributes to this expansion. But contribution is not the same as destiny. A species can possess useful advantages and still depend on favorable circumstances. Homo sapiens survives severe bottlenecks and climatic shifts before expanding widely. Some early migrations beyond Africa appear to leave few descendants. Entire Homo sapiens populations vanish just as populations of other humans do. The groups that eventually spread across Eurasia are survivors of a much larger sequence of demographic experiments, many of which fail. The distinction becomes clearer when the lost cousins are considered on their own timescales. Neanderthals survive for hundreds of thousands of years. Measured against recorded civilization, their existence is almost unimaginably long. Agriculture has existed for only a small fraction of that duration. Cities, states, writing, and industrial societies occupy thinner slices still. Calling Neanderthals evolutionary failures because they eventually disappear mistakes extinction for immediate inadequacy. By that standard, nearly every species that has ever lived is a failure. Homo erectus and related populations survive even longer, spreading across vast areas of the Old World. Island lineages persist through environmental changes that would destroy less adaptable populations. Denisovan-related humans occupy regions from Siberia to high-altitude Asia and probably much farther. Their eventual disappearance cannot erase the fact that their ways of living worked for thousands upon thousands of generations. The surviving species is unusual, partly because it absorbs pieces of the others. Homo sapiens leaves Africa carrying one evolutionary history and then acquires fragments of additional histories through interbreeding. Neanderthal ancestry enters populations across Eurasia. Denisovan ancestry becomes especially significant farther east. Some inherited variants disappear, others remain. A few become valuable in new environments. The adaptation of Tibetan populations to high altitude provides perhaps the clearest symbol of this inheritance. People living in thin mountain air carry a genetic variant connected to Denisovan-related ancestors who'd already confronted the same physiological challenge. The population that first carried that version of the gene disappears as a distinct human lineage, yet part of its solution survives. There was a time when Homo sapiens were not alone. Across the ancient world, other human species walked the same valleys, hunted the same animals, and survived beneath the same changing skies. Some were our rivals, some became our ancestors, and others vanished so completely that only fragments of bone and traces of DNA remain. What happened to humanity's lost cousins? If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten story of our species like this video, subscribe to the channel and join us as we explore the lost cousins who shared our ancient world. Extinction and survival therefore become strangely intertwined. The Denisovans are extinct, but Denisovan DNA is not. Neanderthals vanish, yet fragments of Neanderthal genomes remain scattered across billions of living people. The categories used to describe the ancient world survivor and extinct modern and archaic us and them become less absolute when examined genetically. Still, genes are only a narrow inheritance. Almost everything else is lost. No genome reveals what Neanderthals called one another. It cannot reconstruct the knowledge attached to a particular river bend or the route through a mountain pass taught across generations. Denisovan DNA cannot recover a childhood spent inside the Altai landscape. A Homo floresiensis stone tool cannot tell us how its maker understood the giant reptiles sharing the island. Even if Homo naledi deliberately carried bodies into deep caves, the meaning of that behavior may remain permanently inaccessible. Archaeology works largely with what survives physical decay, and human life consists mostly of things that do not. Voices vanish instantly. Gestures disappear with the people making them. Wood rots. Fibers dissolve. Memories end when they are no longer passed onward. A population may leave thousands of stone artifacts while almost every part of its social world disappears. This is why the growing sophistication of scientific techniques does not make the mystery smaller. Ancient DNA answers questions that seemed impossible a generation ago, then reveals populations nobody knew to ask about. Proteins identify relationships where DNA cannot survive. Cave sediment detects humans without bones. Each discovery illuminates another portion of the landscape, while exposing how much remains dark. Future excavations will almost certainly change parts of the story. New Denisovan fossils may finally reveal more of their anatomy. Additional remains from Flores or Luzon could clarify the ancestry of island humans. African fossils may connect known species to genetic signals currently interpreted only statistically. Some proposed species may eventually be reorganized as researchers understand variation more clearly. Human evolutionary classification has changed repeatedly before and will do so again. What is unlikely to disappear is the broader realization that human evolution is branching, overlapping, and deeply entangled. There is no clean procession in which one species replaces another in orderly sequence. Several populations coexist. They migrate into one another's territories. Some exchange genes. Some probably exchange technologies. Their ranges contract and expand as climates shift. Small communities disappear while others survive. Eventually, one lineage becomes overwhelmingly widespread, but even that lineage carries pieces of the others. Today, every crowded street creates the illusion that humanity has always been singular. A person can cross continents and encounter endless cultural, linguistic, and physical diversity, yet every face belongs to Homo sapiens. The biological uniformity at the species level is so familiar that a world containing several human forms feels almost imaginary. But that world is not imaginary. For most of the relevant prehistoric story, our ancestors are not alone. Somewhere beyond their known territory live humans shaped by different evolutionary histories. Some are close enough to become ancestors of their children. Others are separated by islands or mountains. Some may never meet Homo sapiens at all. They inhabit the same planet beneath the same changing climates until demographic chance, environmental instability, competition, assimilation, and other pressures gradually narrow the family. The final legacy of the lost cousins is therefore not merely that they disappeared, it is that they reveal how contingent our own survival has been. Homo sapiens is not the predetermined endpoint toward which every earlier human was moving. It is the remaining branch of a once wider tree, and when that tree is reconstructed from scattered bones and fragments of ancient DNA, the modern human standing at its tip looks less like the inevitable winner of prehistory and more like the survivor of an extraordinary crowded world whose other voices have fallen silent. The wind still crosses many of the landscapes they knew. It moves through the Altai Mountains, over the limestone of Gibraltar, across the high Tibetan plateau, through African grasslands and into the tropical forests of Southeast Asian islands. The species that once watched those landscapes are mostly gone. Their footprints have disappeared. Their fires have cooled, but some part of their story remains waiting in caves beneath seas, inside fragments of bone, and within us. Word count 191. The world grows quieter when viewed from this distance. The boundaries between species, migrations, extinctions, and discoveries begin to soften, leaving only landscapes changing slowly beneath generations of human lives. A cave entrance gathers dust. A river changes course. Forest returns to a valley where hunters once followed herds. The sea rises over a coastline that held camps no one will ever excavate. Thousands of years pass without anyone remembering that another kind of human once stood there. Their disappearance is not unusual in the history of life. Species emerge, spread change, and vanish continuously. What makes these lost populations different to us is their closeness. Their hands shaped stone. Their families cared for children. They learned the movements of animals and the rhythms of seasons. Some looked across a fire at ancestors of people living today. Some became those ancestors. The surviving traces are extraordinarily small compared with everything that has been lost. A tooth in a cave may represent generations of lives. A few percentages of inherited DNA may be the final biological echo of populations that once occupied enormous territories. A single fragment of finger bone can restore an entire branch of humanity to scientific knowledge after tens of thousands of years of silence. There are almost certainly more fragments waiting. Perhaps they lie beneath sediments in a cave not yet entered, beneath a drowned Ice Age coastline, or inside a museum drawer where an unusual fossil has waited decades for a new method of analysis. Perhaps some cousins will never be recovered at all, their existence reduced to faint statistical shadows inside genomes. The human past does not owe the present a complete record, and so the story ends without a final answer to every disappearance. There is no single moment when humanity becomes alone, no final fire that can be identified with certainty as the last fire of another human lineage. There is only a gradual narrowing until one branch remains visible. That branch is ours, but it did not grow by itself. Far behind it stand Neanderthals, Denisovans, island humans, African lineages and others whose names have been lost before names could ever be preserved. Their world is gone, but not entirely erased. In the quietest traces of prehistory, they remain close enough to remind us that being the last does not mean having always been alone.